Hello and good morning and good evening to our friends from Israel and from around the world. It's truly an honor to be here with you and to take part in this unique conference. My name is Michal Divon, and I'm proud to be your MC today. Over the past couple of months, we have all had to grasp with the new reality of COVID-19, what we now call the new normal. But for hundreds of thousands of people, this new normal meant more than working from home or preserving their health. For many, it meant their lives were turned upside down. Thankfully, as always, civil society stepped up and worked tirelessly to support the hardest hit communities. On this occasion today, American and Israeli leaders and philanthropists have gathered to discuss their work, the challenges they've faced, and their success in order to mutually benefit and help prepare for the future. Our goal is that this conference serves as an opportunity to boost discussion amongst those who took the reign in leading the civil response, both in Israel and in the United States. We hope that together we will be able to define best practices for dealing with COVID-19 and lead the way from chaos to relief. I'd like to now welcome Jeff Schwartz and Darmon for opening remarks. Jeff Schwartz is the chairman of American Friends of Latet. Aside from his work with Latet, he is Maoz's board chairman. Jeff served as CEO of Timberland for 15 years, where he led a social agenda. In 2011, Jeff led the sale of Timberland to the VF Corporation. He continues to focus on improving civil society both in Israel and in the US. Jeff just made Aliyah and now lives in Jerusalem with his family. Darmon, whom you all know, is the founder and president of Latet. Founded the organization after making Aliyah from France. His vision was to build the first large-scale Israeli humanitarian organization, and here we are 24 years later. Since its launch, has been in charge of strategic development and growth as he continues to plan for the future. Without further ado, please welcome Jeff Schwartz.
Michal, thank you. It is a privilege to participate with you in this conversation. We meet at an historic moment, a moment that's characterized by, on the global basis, by historic distrust in a context of structural and radical uncertainty, like at least I can say in my 60 years I've never experienced. And frankly, in a moment where it seems evident to all eyes that there is an erosion of resilience and hope. Poverty is hard to ignore. In Israel, just 1 second ago, there were 30,000 unemployed, and today, almost overnight, 800,000. And the same gripping reality is in the United States and across the globe. Feeding the hungry used to be about them, but now, of a sudden, it's about us. Everyone knows someone who is out of work. Everyone knows somebody who's struggling. The global pandemic did not create the underlying challenges of poverty or social dislocation, but this pandemic has broadened the gaps and is revealing to us the pain of those who are food insecure, those without a social net or a social network, all around us. Prior models were inadequate. They were. And so in this moment, the imperative to reimagine solutions socially and civically is simply unavoidable. When social challenges accelerate at a rate and a pace that's greater than existing democratic systems can respond, then the call upon leaders like you and me is clarion clear. This is a unique context here today. We have practitioners from different sectors and from different stories, from Israel and from America, in conversation about how to feed the hungry and how to assuage the heartbroken amidst pandemic. In dark times, to learn from leaders as you about light is deeply moving to me. I spent 25 years in corporate America learning from leaders like Bill Shore that it is the job of private enterprise to feed the hungry and to clothe the naked, even as you earn superior return for shareholders. I've learned for more than 10 years here in Israel from social entrepreneurs like Gilles and the entire team at Latet that networks of common cause can dare solutions to seemingly intractable issues like poverty and hunger. When Dr. King wrote that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, when he asserted that we are caught in an inescapable net of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny, I think he was envisioning leaders like you working together on a single garment of destiny, sharing strengths, giving from one source of light to another for deepened impact. L'or goyim, a light of nations. That is what brings me to this conversation. As the crisis sprang upon our nations, as the weakest and the most marginalized were and are exposed in deadly and urgent fashion, I watched Latet pivot with an incredible, elegant urgency, galvanizing a coalition to deliver literally life-saving outcomes. And I watched as Share Our Strength did the same, mobilizing with a speed and volume unprecedented, extraordinary impact for Americans bowled over by pandemic. Those of you who are philanthropists, those of you who are change makers, those of you who are involved in this process in America, in New York, in Philadelphia, in Boston, in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, you have been part to this process of somehow inventing the impossible in crisis. It's been my privilege to serve leaders like you, people like Bill and Gilles, and it's my deep belief that our different experiences with the pandemic and the breathtaking impact on citizens, both here and in America, in two riven tribal democracies, desperately trying to live up to the lofty standards of the social contract that we ostensibly offer all our citizens. My deep belief is that our different experiences can inform and inspire each other, and more importantly, hopefully drive an engagement together that will shine light in Tel Aviv, here in Jerusalem, in New York, and beyond. Thank you for choosing to be part of this conversation. It's now my privilege to introduce a friend and a teacher, Gilles Darmon, who is the founder and the chair of the Latet movement in Israel. Latet in Hebrew, the verb to give, is not an invitation, rather it's an imperative to Gilles in whichever language, his native French, his eloquent Hebrew, or his elegant English, whichever language you find himself living in, the language without words is the language of giving. I consider Gilles a stubborn visionary, an elegant soul, but a relentless one. I look forward to hearing him and learning from him and from you as you lead us today. Gilles?
Thank you, Jeff, for your warm and kind words. It's an honor to open this virtual conference on the civilian society response to COVID-19 and to initiate the dialogue between the US and Israel on this topic. I'd like to thank all the distinguished speakers of this conference who have agreed to join us in this important conversation. Know that I don't take it for granted that you found the time to take a step back and think with us on how we can, as a community of professionals, do better. When we found Latet in 1996, we hoped to provide part of a response to the persistent problem of poverty and hunger within Israeli society. We came together and built what we are proud to say today as one of the leading organizations in the country. Very much a part of the startup nation, Latet was motivated by innovation, by creativity, the desire to solve problems, to think out of the box, to dream big. And as I personally look back on this journey, what I think we succeeded in most is to bring along millions of Israelis from all communities who have helped us build one of the country's widest civilian movements. Today, Latet is one of the largest national food banks and will distribute this year's more than $45 million worth of food to over 60,000 families. Latet also cares on a daily basis for thousands of Holocaust survivors, a mission that took a whole new meaning in the past couple of months. More than ever, our elders need our mobilization, our support, and our care. Over the years, we fought to serve those in need, to change the public discourse on poverty, and to be an engine for Israeli civil society. And it is the same motivation that had led us to launch our emergency response to the COVID-19 crisis, and that is bringing us all together here. I very well remember the moment I realized how serious the situation was. It was March 4th, and we had finished a conversation with one of the directors of the Israeli Health Ministry. She had just shared with us the ministry COVID-19 casualty forecast, and let me tell you that it was clear we were on the eve of the worst public health crisis in our country's modern history. So as a leading organization, it was obvious that we had a role to play in responding to this unique public health crisis. In a span of 24 hours, Latet team mobilized itself to massively expand our operation, reaching the homes of 15,000 elders at once, and to increase the size of our food basket for over 60,000 families. More than that, we did it with a coalition of organizations, a unique partnership with local governments and the Israeli Defense Force, and the exceptional mobilization of donors from all over the world. Yet, in spite of all the tools we have built over time, we face many questions, doubts, and a challenging need for instant decision making at a time of so much uncertainty. But this conference is first of all an act of faith and the power of collective intelligence and sharing experience as tools to dramatically better the capability of our community of doers. Today, and for the next 3 hours, we will openly discuss our victory and defeats in this battle against the pandemic and its societal impact. Over the past months, we have witnessed the outstanding mobilization of men and women who work around the clock to provide relief to those in distress, to bring us one step closer to the end of the tunnels, to the end of the darkness, to keep the hope alive in spite of the hardships. It is their voice that we want to bring to you, their testimonies that we want to hear today, and I hope that together we can pave the way to a better tomorrow. But before this very exciting conference begins, I would like to thank specifically some of the people who contribute to make this event a success, starting with my dear friend Jeff Schwartz, who inspired this adventure. This is my opportunity, Jeff, to tell you how grateful we are for your support and involvement with Latet for so many years now. Since we first met, you have been a true source of inspiration and encouragement. Zach Fassman, our source of wisdom and encouragement. Thank you, David Cheeser, who helped us navigate US society in the Jewish American community, and Jacob Schimmel, problem solver per excellence. A special thanks to Uri Leventer from the New York Federation, who was instrumental in imagining this conference and who made me believe that this is doable. Finally, I cannot conclude without thanking Eran Weintrob, the CEO of Latet, my partner in Latet Journey for many years, and all the Latet team that work on this event, headed by Ella Drori, Latet project manager for the conference, the unstoppable lady, possessing an impressive alliance of determinations, intelligence, and diplomacy. I wish to all of us a successful and incredibly fruitful dialogue, but above all, for this discussion to be the beginning of a permanent dialogue. I wish for us to use each parcel of our common knowledge to face one of the most challenging crises of the last decades. The COVID-19 is here to stay for quite a long, but I have no doubts that we will be victorious. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff and G, for your inspiring work. New York City was the epicenter of COVID-19 at the start of the pandemic, causing immediate distress among residents and communities. The UJA Federation of New York, one of the world's largest local philanthropies, worked tirelessly around the clock to support the community through its various programming, food distribution, and mental health services. Since the nature of the pandemic changed over time, UJA has adapted its strategy in order to support the city of New York. Eric Goldstein, a longtime active member of the New York Jewish community, was tasked with leading UJA Federation during this unprecedented period. Prior to his role as CEO, Eric served a number of senior roles at Federation. He also serves as a board member at Yeshiva University, the Manhattan Day School, Beth Din of America, and the Ramaz School. I am pleased to welcome our first keynote speaker, the CEO of UJA New York, Mr. Eric Goldstein.
Thank you, Michal. It's a pleasure being here with you. I'm Eric Goldstein, the CEO of UJA Federation of New York. I'm honored to have been asked to speak at this conference convened by Latet, a partner of UJA Federation and an incredible organization serving thousands of people in need in Israel each and every day. This is the very first time in my life when I cannot simply get on a plane and fly to Israel. My wife and I spent a year living in Israel with our 4 children about 15 years ago, and more recently, between visiting family and traveling on behalf of UJA, in a regular year, I'd find myself in Israel every few months. I'll never take that privilege for granted ever again. I am, though, delighted to say that my youngest daughter is in Israel now for a gap year before heading to college. And I'm especially delighted to say that she just finished her bidud, a 2-week quarantine, and can now join with the Israeli students at her midrashah. In short, my personal connection to Israel runs deep. But today for me, like many others in the United States, Israel feels farther away than ever before. These past 6 months have been very difficult for the New York Jewish community, but we've had a measure of comfort in knowing we're not alone. In particular, in March and April, when the New York Jewish community was suffering tremendously from illness and loss, friends and colleagues in Israel were in constant touch, reaching out to help or just offer a few words of support. And as Israel itself has gone through multiple phases in the virus, we've stayed closely connected to make sure our partners are equipped to serve those in need. This may very well be the only crisis in the history of our countries that has had such universal impact. And because of that, while we're physically apart, none of us is alone. It's that concept, the idea that no one should face these challenges alone, that has animated all of UJA's work these last 6 months. When New York first went into lockdown back in March and quickly became the epicenter of the pandemic, our immediate focus was on emergency needs. We allocated $46 million in emergency funding, comprised of grants and interest-free loans, to support both the critical social service sector and essential Jewish communal institutions. These emergency funds were used for dramatically increased food distribution, emergency cash assistance, support to seniors and Holocaust survivors, funding to ensure dignified Jewish burials for victims of the virus whose families could not otherwise afford, loans and grants to 22 Jewish community centers, 24 Jewish summer camps, and 47 Jewish day schools and yeshivot. These are big numbers, but beyond the numbers, it's the individual stories that remind us of the impact of our work. For example, during the height of the health crisis, UJA delivered 8,500 Pesach Seder plates and meals to homebound elderly and families in need. One afternoon, I got a call from one recipient, a 97-year-old woman who gives $180 each year to UJA, and she was calling to let us know she was sending another gift of $50 to express her gratitude for this delivery. I called her back to thank her, and on the phone she said that she'd be alone for the first Pesach of her life, and that when she opened this package, she burst into tears upon seeing that it had everything she needed and would never have had otherwise. She said she'd rarely felt such a sense of gratitude in our almost 10 decades of life. It's stories like these that power our work each and every day. Let me repeat that. It's stories like these that power our work each and every day. While thankfully here in New York, the health crisis has currently abated, the challenges remain enormous. We continue to convene on a weekly, if not more frequent basis, all the agencies in our network, sector by sector, to discuss and share expertise around the current and evolving needs. Over the last few months, it's become increasingly clear that the most critical areas of continuing need will center around food insecurity, unemployment, and mental health support. Quite frankly, our current system is stretched beyond capacity. UJA's nearly $160 million grants budget this year prioritizes these areas. However, it's clear that more will need to be done. Just last Friday, for example, our board authorized an additional $6.7 million in funding from our endowment to increase capacity for safety net and social services, and also to help cash-strapped Jewish day schools transition safely to in-person learning. I fully expect that we will seek additional funding from our endowment as the year progresses to address the staggering need. To speak about our work in Israel specifically, in the early days of the crisis, we advanced $4.2 million to nearly 60 overseas grantees so operations could continue to run as smoothly as possible. We then granted an additional $1 million to support a variety of critical areas of need, including to Latet, to enable them to support Holocaust survivors throughout the crisis, and to other partners, such as the Jewish Agency, the Keynote, and Eran, to provide loan funds for nonprofits and small businesses. We also provided funding to the Israel Trauma Coalition to provide mental health support for caregivers, to Ma'oz, a partner in this conference, to bring leaders together to create systemic solutions, and to the Israeli Association of Community Centers to mobilize thousands of volunteers throughout Israel. Federations operate day in and day out, but it's during times of crisis that the community most understands the unique power of our work. Only a federation, working with both vital human service agencies and Jewish communal institutions, could mount such an expansive emergency response, helping hundreds of thousands of people and simultaneously enabling critical communal institutions to survive. On a related note, before this pandemic, one of the focuses at UJA Federation was bridging the gap between American Jews and Israelis. Here in America, we'd long prioritized bringing Americans on trips to Israel and other forms of Israel education. More recently, we focused on helping Israelis understand more about the American Jewish community and all its diversity in order to strengthen the notion of peoplehood and connection between our communities. We've been funding trips, bringing influential Israelis, Chavrei Knesset, journalists, and educational professionals to New York, and also working with the Ministry of Education to implement curricula on world Jewry in Israel's schools. Now, of course, travel isn't possible, but we see in new ways that our sense of connection and mutual responsibility for one another is strong. You need look no further than this conference to see the arevut between our communities. We find ourselves bridging the gap through the shared experience of this crisis. We have an international pool of learned expertise and the ability to bring that wisdom together, binding our communities together more tightly and leveraging our resources to benefit more people. It's critical that we continue to leverage this moment, strengthening the bridge between the United States and Israel, exchanging ideas and best practices on how to most effectively address the pandemic and our common challenges ahead. We'd all have preferred for it to be something other than a crisis that brought us together at this moment, and we'd all rather be together than apart. I certainly have preferred to deliver these remarks in person in Israel, and please God, we'll be able to come together in person again soon. In the meantime, thanks very much again to Latet for creating this important platform to come together and share wisdom. And thanks so much to all of you, the participants in today's conference, for all you do on behalf of our community.
Thank you, Eric, for your great work and for sharing this insight. Now, while New York was the early epicenter of the virus, it has since spread across the country, vulnerable populations in Los Angeles face many of the same challenges and limitations. The Jewish Federation of LA developed a community response plan to meet both the dietary and social needs of the community. Jay Sanderson led this response as the president and CEO of the Jewish Federation of Greater Los Angeles. Jay has been professionally active in the Jewish community for over 30 years and has been recognized on the Forward 50 list as one of America's leading entrepreneurs. Please welcome Jay Sanderson.
Thank you, Michal. I'm speaking to you from Los Angeles, California, where unfortunately we were probably more prepared for this historic pandemic than any Jewish community in the Jewish world. Why? Because we've had tragedies like this before: earthquakes, devastating fires. And after the economic crash in 2009, 2010, our Jewish community decided we had to be prepared for the worst. And so we built an enterprise called the Ezra Network, where we have social workers working with the Federation throughout the community, dealing with what I call Act One of this 4-act play that we call a pandemic. And Act One was the immediate onslaught of social service needs. A dramatic increase in vulnerable people living in Los Angeles, living in poverty, including our treasured Holocaust survivors, and frankly, including children and young adults. And we were immediately went into an active mode to make sure that all their needs were met. We redoubled our efforts in dealing with food insecurity, making sure we were delivering thousands of prepared meals. We activated our emergency cash grant program. We added an interest-free loan program to make sure that those who couldn't pay their bills could pay their bills either with grants or loans. We had to, of course, add resources to that, and I'll get to that in a moment. Act Two for our Jewish community was the dramatic impact on the Jewish ecosystem. And that's summer camps, early childhood centers, schools, synagogues, and other Jewish institutions that are basically the lifeblood of our Jewish community. In doing all of this, we were reminded, as I think most Jewish communities around in North America were reminded, about the centrality of the Jewish Federation. Our Jewish Federation is basically doing our job 364 days a year to make sure on that 365th day, when there is a crisis, that we're ready and able. And like I said, we were ready and able. And in Act Two, we just spent a lot of time, and we continue to spend a lot of time weekly and sometimes daily talking to the heads of all the organizations to find out what their needs are. From that, we created a care fund where we are investing an extraordinary amount of money in helping Jewish organizations reopen when they're able to reopen. And so we had to do really only one thing, and that was to raise more money to fuel all the operations that we had already put in place in 2009 and 2010. And I'm proud to say that we are on top of that. And I'm also proud to say that we recognized at the very beginning when we went online, our whole building went online in March, and we pivoted, that we didn't think this was going to be a short-term challenge. And today we look at this as an issue that will go on for years, not just the need for a vaccine and people's need to feel more comfortable before they go into large gatherings and congregate, but also the economic impact it's going to have. And so we look at this as basically a 5-year problem, 5-year crisis, and we're trying to do everything we can to make sure that when we get out of this, we're as whole as possible. Our philosophy in Los Angeles reflects our philosophy in Israel and around the world. We're working directly with our partners in Israel, including Latet, which we are really proud to partner with, and Unistream, working with some of the poorest kids in the poorest neighborhoods throughout Israel to make sure that the issues that we care about in terms of poverty, in terms of food insecurity, in terms of the Jewish ecosystem is whole in Israel and around the world as it is in Los Angeles. So I deeply appreciate having this opportunity to spend some time with you talking about how in Los Angeles we have reacted, how in Los Angeles we have planned, and how in Los Angeles we are planning not just for the immediate crises, but for the morning after, the days after, the weeks after. I understand that all of us feel like we're living in darkness. We've been living in darkness for 6 months, but I am optimistic that from that darkness will be a great light. that great light we're creating in Los Angeles, and we're creating with you today and tomorrow around the world. We are that great light. I deeply appreciate all the work you're all doing, and I thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Jay, for sharing your perspective. Over the past 24 years, Latet has been supporting populations in need. We will share a short video capturing Latet's work during COVID-19.
אנחנו נמצאים פה בבסיס צה"ל בצריפין, שיתוף פעולה ייחודי בין החברה האזרחית לצבא, אחרי שבמשך השלושה שבועות האחרונים אנחנו נערכים בארגון לתת יחד עם הקרן לידידות במשימה לאומית שהיא משימה מצילת חיים. ביחד לנסות לבלום את ההתפשטות של מגפת הקורונה על ידי זה שאנחנו ננגיש ל-15,000 קשישים נזקקים בגיל 75 ומעלה מזון ומוצרים היגייניים שיספיקו להם לחודש שלם. נעשה את זה במשך 3 חודשים במטרה שהם יישארו בבתים.
והיפה ביותר בפעולה הזאת זה ההתגייסות האזרחית המסיבית. אני מאוד גאה שבסופו של דבר ארגון לתת נמצא בראש החץ האזרחית הזאת.
היה לי ממש חשוב לבוא היום, היה חשוב לעשות משהו עם הזמן שלנו, משהו שייתן לאחרים, ובארגון לתת נותנים את ההזדמנות הזאת להתנדב.
שלום. מה אני יכולה להגיד? אני מתרגשת שמישהו חושב על זקנים גם.
אני הבאתי עכשיו חבילה של אוכל לחג, פלוס חבילת היגיינה. אוכלוסייה חזקה כמונו צריכה לדעת לתרום ולתת מעצמה, מהזמן שלה, לאוכלוסייה חלשה. אם לא יהיה את האיזון הזה של לתת מחזק לחלש, המדינה הזאת, האנשים פה לא ישרדו. ואני נהנה לעשות את זה.
For our first panel today, our speakers will be discussing food safety in the time of quarantine. As restrictions and lockdown were put in place, food access became a daily challenge for many. Hundreds of thousands of residents lined up at various food pantries and applied for additional food benefits. Organizations already working with the vulnerable populations readjusted their strategies in order to meet the sudden increase in demand. I would like to introduce our distinguished panel of experts. Melissa Greenberg, the Executive Vice President of the Federation of Greater Philadelphia. Melissa was instrumental in leading the Federation response during this crisis. Alex Roth-Kahn, Managing Director of the Caring Department at UJA Federation of New York. She advances the organization's commitment to ensure that those struggling with life's challenges are supported by the Jewish community. Bill Shore, Executive Chair of Share Our Strength. He has led the organization since its founding and raised more than $700 million to fight hunger and poverty. Eran Weintrob, Executive Director of Latet. Aside from his work with Latet organization, he led the largest civil society coalition in Israel. And finally, Jeff Schwartz, a long-term food security advocate, social change entrepreneur, and moderator of our panel. Because we also want to hear from you, please send us your questions via the chat on the side of the screen. Our moderator, Jeff, will take questions at the end of the panel. Without further ado, Jeff Schwartz, the stage is yours.
Jewish Federation of Philadelphia. She is a woman who knows the hearts and concerns of her native city, having advanced academic, civic, cultural, and political progress across the city for her entire career. Eran Weintrob is the CEO of Latet. He is a veteran community leader with deep roots in the communities he serves across all of Israel. He is one of the warriors who never looks away from the faces who suffer. And he always dresses in black. He's a hipster. Alexander Roth-Kahn leads the Caring Department at UJA Federation of New York, which seeks to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, and care for the marginalized in New York, in Israel, and in the former Soviet Union. Alex, we also thank you for the incredible role you played in helping make this conversation today possible at all. Bill Shore is the founder, with his sister Debbie, of Share Our Strength, one of the preeminent forces in America for children and families who struggle with the burden of poverty. No Kid Hungry is but one example of the cross-sectoral, inclusive innovations that SOS invents and scales. Bill is also a volunteer firefighter in his community in Maine. I'm serious. Let's begin. Melissa, you're first. You ready? You have to unmute yourself. When need exploded across the community that is your home, how did you create priorities for a communal response? How did food access become a first order priority within the Federation in this moment of crisis?
Thank you, and nice to be with you all. I think on what's going to be a very, very important conversation, and we will all learn from each other. I think in Philadelphia at the end of March, we were all in a state of shock, and I think the world was. And we could only see what was happening literally around our eyes, which was, I'll give you just one example. In our most active senior center, where thousands of seniors go every day to be together, to socialize, and to have meals, was closed. Immediately, those people that rely on going to the Klein Life JCC could not go there. And let's add to that, the people that we have a very active Meals on Wheels program through this same center, but the people that volunteer to put the meals together and distribute them out also were homebound now. Everyone was locked down. And most of those people are retirees who were at the most risk. So number one, we didn't have the people coming in. And number two, we didn't have people coming together to make the meals. And this layers upon layers upon layers. And we just had to step in. So as the Jewish Federation, we immediately created a COVID emergency fund that had tremendous response. And people's first question was, what is this going to do? And it is going to serve the most basic needs of our community. And we really started there. And that was our focus through March, really through the end of June, was just taking care of food issues in our community.
Spectacular. Thank you for your service. Our second question goes to the man in black. Eran, food insecurity is a core business at Latet. But when the crisis erupted, you needed to develop a radical new model for serving almost overnight. So we want to understand, how did you get a big organization like Latet to swing so far, so fast, so elegantly?
Thank you, Jeff. A significant part of from Latet DNA is operating during emergency times. In the past, we sent overseas 25 delegations of emergency aid in times of civil wars and nature disasters. And in Israel, we responded during the floods in Tel Aviv 20 years ago, the Second Lebanon War, and Tzuk Eitan operations. So at Latet, we have a protocol and a mode of emergency operation with specific procedures when everyone in our staff knows exactly what is his role when we declared an emergency mode. Our ability to switch to emergency mode early in March was based on our experience and thanks to the dramatic discussion we had with the Ministry of Health that clarified us that we are heading a long and tough campaign. But what helped us the most were four crucial decisions we made. First, we understood that this is a social war and great efforts are needed. When we were speaking about the scale of the challenge, you, Jeff, asked us how we are going to achieve the goals we set. We said that we don't know yet, but we will. We don't have any other options because so many people are counting on us and we are facing a true moment in our history. Now, focusing on elderly, thanks to the understanding that the arena, we were able to map and define the most urgent needy elderly, and shape the most effective intervention to provide accessibility for food and hygiene products so they won't take risks to get infected by the virus, and we will be able to help our country to slow down the spread of the pandemic. But if our challenge regards elderly and Holocaust survivors in our Chef IL and Aid for Life programs on day-to-day is to ease their loneliness, here we had to isolate them in their apartments and hopefully reduce the risk of getting ill from the virus. Only a few hours ago, during a meeting of the State Audit Committee in the Knesset, Michaela Glotter, 83 Holocaust survivors, said in her testimonials that she is afraid from the upcoming quarantine that we're going to have before Rosh Hashanah, and being among four walls bring her back to the ghetto. So now we understand that the loneliness might sometimes be as dangerous as COVID-19. Now we took another two decisions, the 90 days decision to provide an emergency aid for 90 days. Our estimation was built under the assumption that we are the front and first line of defense, and as a civil society, we should serve as a social safety net. We assumed that the government would take over after that period of time, something that unfortunately did not happen. And now the last one, we decided to continue our work as a national food bank and umbrella organization, cooperating with 100 local NGOs around the country, supporting 60,000 families in need. That decision was easy to take, but not as easy to execute, because as you know, Jeff, within 3 weeks, we developed an operational and financial infrastructure that multiplied our scale 15 times. Thank you.
I like that. The crisis was understood as a war. It's a powerful bit of language, Eran. Alex, we listened to Eric's keynote address a moment ago when he discussed this impossible reality, the initial devastation in New York and the extraordinary pressure that your entire organization at the UJA was under. What part of your response was about coalition building in the midst of crisis? And my question is, how did you manage to deal with this torrent of crisis and coalition build at the same time?
Well, thank you for having me. I'm so delighted to be here. And to answer the question more specifically, yes, we were overwhelmed with need. In fact, we continue to be overwhelmed with need. One of the first things that we did in early March was to reach out, as you've noted, to other funders. And we joined a profound amount of both funding coalitions as well as advocacy coalitions focused on moving New York State legislation and policy. In the funding realm, we partnered in the very early days with the Ford Foundation and Bloomberg Philanthropies to create at launch, $80 million fund covering all of the needs of New York City, with a number of other funders, all contributing in many, many ways to really map out the city and ensure that there were dollars flowing to every vulnerable community. And we also participated with the New York Community Trust in a second fund to distribute emergency cash, many of which was used for vouchers to purchase food on behalf of families. UJA Federation allocated $2 million of those dollars. Most of the funding actually went to migrant workers, individuals who weren't able to benefit from the federal recovery plan that was put forward, individuals who are not necessarily American citizens, and folks who benefited most from cash tips and working in environments where they were being paid through cash. And we knew that we had to reach them immediately. And in the advocacy front, we joined a number of very important coalitions. Some of you might be aware that New York City sponsors a hot meals program that is most frequently experienced within the New York City school system, where students are able to receive a free hot meal, both for breakfast and for lunch. That program is also available in the yeshivas for qualifying students who require kosher food. Although the city was able to easily move to a distribution mechanism for the non-kosher meals for students who participate in public schools and were unable to access their food, they really struggled in the first few weeks, even the first 2 months, to set up a system for kosher grab and go meals. And we did a tremendous amount of advocacy with a number of partners that ultimately led to 6 locations being established throughout Brooklyn and Queens. So too, the Department for Aging, DFTA in New York City, provides funding for congregate meals, hot meals that are experienced in group settings for senior citizens, older adults, frail, isolated, low-income seniors. When the community centers shut down, which they did in early March, a system was put in place to ensure that hot food was delivered to the homes of those individuals. But we faced a similar barrier in ensuring that kosher food and high quality kosher food was delivered to seniors that require a kosher product. And so we were faced with some of the same barriers and the same coalition development to ensure that a plan was put into place. And finally, UJA Federation was invited by the mayor's office to sit at a funding table to ensure that more monies that were being allocated through the city a total of $25 million that is now budgeted for food on behalf of the New York City mayor, had a strong and articulate data-driven process to get those foods out. And UJA was called upon to sit at the mayor's office to help to fund the research, to cull through the research, and ultimately make recommendations on how the city's distribution channels might work best.
It's amazing that you described this crisis within a crisis, because the need for kosher food it's just another reminder of the global nature of pandemic. And clearly one size does not fit all or solve all, and the need for us to be nimble. And so we see it, certainly Latet sees it all day long. There are people who will eat a certain kashrut, not another kind. But the end of the day is, it used to be them that were hungry. Now it's us that's hungry. And so the work that you did in New York to be at the table and to be able to make sure that the specific needs of a kosher eating community were met are an important case history, because I think Jay Sanderson said it earlier, this isn't going away. This conversation is going to continue through time. And so learnings like that about particularized and data-driven stuff is really important. So thank you for that. Billy, your turn. I watched as Share Our Strength mobilized teams and coalitions as never before. And you've only been doing this for sort of 25 plus years. And so as never before, unprecedented says a lot in the context of you. You raised unprecedented resources. I know you did, from whole new corners of the universe. Can you say a little bit about these new resources and how, as this continues, it doesn't come and go, but as COVID continues, how are you going to avoid the disaster fundraising trap? Like, quick, the next hurricane, quick, the next disaster. As COVID dislocation moved from being an event to being an ongoing reality, how is Share Our Strength going to continue to marshal resources going forward?
Yeah, well, great questions, Jeff. Thanks. One of the things I learned from you is that every battle is won or lost before it's fought. And you learned that probably from Sun Tzu. So it goes way back, this wisdom. But in our case, I think we had invested in building brand. We had invested in our advocacy muscle. We had invested in capacity in ways that at the time we were making those investments, probably some people didn't understand, but they put us in a position when this crisis began to really build a much broader base. So we've ended up with, close to 100,000 new donors who found us and have enabled us to reach out across the country and be agile. You used the word nimble a moment ago. Kind of the common thread from everybody on this call so far is this incredible agility, having to turn on a dime when this crisis occurred. And so we were able to do the same thing. Our model became completely inverted. We were making school feeding programs work and all the schools were closed. So that necessitated an entire alternate universe of feeding programs. Unfortunately, we had the support to do that. I think our stakeholders, just like everybody else on this call, I think understand the need to be nimble. So in terms of the second part of your question, people have an understanding that and at least what we're seeing is that the economic crisis is going to last probably a lot longer even than the health crisis, and that we need to be investing these resources, not just for the next pandemic, which there could be, or a next wave, but because the underlying poverty has, kind of risen to the surface now, and people see that, and they want us to be investing in ways that they'd never wanted us to be investing in before. We have a new permission from our consumers to do stuff that we'd always wanted to do, and now finally can, in terms of getting to some of the root causes of why people are hungry in the first place.
So, Billy, I follow up with you. Do you think that this new permission, that the crisis as it's evolved and as the cracks it's revealed, has it made, are you sensing that this crisis has shifted responsibility and authority in the food access ecosystem? Is there a rebalancing of who's responsible for what? Is there a different sense? When you say a new permission, is it fundamental or is it circumstantial? Do you think people's attitudes are shifting? Philanthropists, government, social service organizations, for-profit business. No one said anything so far about for-profit business. And as a recovering CEO, there should be some mention of the food industry here in this crisis. Do you think things are shifting in a fundamental way, Billy, or do you see it's still unclear?
Yeah, they're definitely shifting, Jeff. And I guess the real question is, baked into your word fundamentally, are these long-term shifts or are they transient and temporary? So the shift that we saw, for example, in addition to an enormous amount of public awareness that we had never been able to bring to the issue on our own, was in the heat of this crisis, the first thing we had to do was to get Congress to change a lot of laws so that we could feed kids in different ways and that those meals would still be federally reimbursed. Kids were not getting their meals in the school cafeteria. Kids were not coming to get them at all. Their parents were. We couldn't give them one meal a day. We had to give them 10 meals so that they could take them home. All those laws had to be changed. And when we told Congress, the shift was when we said to Congress, you need to make this change, they made it immediately. They said, you have the expertise. They've never trusted us in this way before. So they said, you have the expertise. There's a crisis. We got to get moving. We'd rather ask forgiveness than permission. We'll do it. How long that will last, I don't know. But hopefully it's built up some credibility. And when I say we, I don't just mean share our strength. I mean the broader anti-hunger community. Hopefully it builds up some credibility so policymakers look to us to do some of these things that we've been asking them to do before.
Super powerful. Eran, I'm going to ask you, and then Alex, I'm going to follow up the same point to you because, Eran, you made reference to conversation in the Knesset and the Israeli legislature earlier today. And so Billy talked about an unbelievable outcome, right? The law said you can only give a child a meal one at a time in a school. Now there's no schools and I got to deliver bulk meals. And so how am I going to do that? I got to change a law. Change a law. It's like losing weight. Good luck, right? But somehow the ecosystem created a nimbleness that it's not seen before. Do you see that kind of shift as either possible or actually happening? Unmute yourself, Eran.
Thank you, Jeff. First, referring to what Alex said before, I mean, when the government first responded to the outbreak, they asked the army to operate, they asked the local welfare municipalities, and they asked the retailers. They tried to make a bypass on the civil society and the NGOs. And now after operating for the last 6 months, we see in Israel that food insecurity was not so acceptable and acknowledgeable before, but now it is. And you don't know that, Jeff, yet, but last week we had a meeting with the Prime Minister that asked us to find out what are the needs regards Rosh Hashanah and the whole year. And he, even though it's small money regards the needs, he multiplied 3 times the allocations that the government give to support the NGOs with the food basket. So I think that, first of all, food insecurity is going to be acknowledgeable more than before. And we might fulfill our visionary goal to advocate and to challenge the government to take more responsibility regards what's needed, because with all the respect for ours, for Latet and the other NGOs, the government must react, like in the state that there are about $67 billion for food, if I'm not wrong. It's about 1.6% from the federal budget, and in Israel, it's not the same.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. Joel Berg from Hunger Free America sent a question in at this panel that was aimed at this very point that both you and Billy have made. And I'm going to ask Alex to comment on it in a second too, which is that we're talking about charity. We're talking about the role of philanthropy in this crisis. But Joel's question was like, hello, where's the largest source of any kind of social network, which is the government? Now, both Billy and Eran have spoken to that eloquently. Alex, you spoke about being around the table with the mayor's office. So this is now not national government. This is actually very local government. How do you see the power construct going forward as COVID continues to evolve? You think the government has learned about a different kind of nimbleness or a different kind of compassion in the context of feeding the hungry and COVID?
I think that we work in parallel and we work together in partnership. UJA Federation, whenever possible, will try to leverage a public-private funding relationship so that government dollars are leveraged to the degree possible and that philanthropy is then able to innovate when necessary and when the opportunity presents itself. So in truth, through Feeding America, which is not substantial enough, there is a system in place to get food to local food pantries, local food banks throughout our country, where UJA Federation and other philanthropies, but we lead in this area quite significantly, has found its sweet spot is really in the delivery of that food. So we have converted over the course of the past 2 years, 6 food pantries, and we're on our way to convert 18 to a digital mechanism in which people are able to order their food from a screen at home, from a computer at the library, from an iPad that is brought to them through a volunteer, or through their smartphone. And the selections of food are incentivized by a point system so that healthy options are fewer points. So what we have done is to take the food that is by and large paid for by government, supplemented continuously by philanthropic dollars, and to enable the system to evolve so that it is one of empowerment and dignity, and low-income populations are able to have self-choice, take responsibility for their diet and for their health. And in a period of a global health pandemic, how extraordinary is it that we are able to provide access to our food pantries without in-person communication? And some of our partners actually leveraged Uber, which is a for-profit company driving around product, instead of driving people to the airport because they weren't going, to deliver food in bulk, in mass, to many food insecure individuals in our region.
Alex, what's so about what you just described, because in terms of what we're dreaming about in this conversation, is that in Los Angeles, I don't know if the Los Angeles Federation has that user interface built yet. I don't know if they have access to that digital stuff. I know that here in Israel, we have versions of this idea. We do at Latet. But when you think about the community that we're trying to create, this notion of sharing light and building solutions that can be leveraged, I'm really excited to hear about the idea of contactless, dignified agency, so that a person who is poor, which is very different than a poor person, right? A person who is poor is different than a poor person. And so if a person who is poor has the ability to do the equivalent of Instacart and be treated with some kind of dignity, that's a kind of best practice that I know it's part of the way you operate, but it's exactly why we wanted this conversation, so we could share those kind of ideas. Melissa, I need to ask you in the city, because you have a perspective of the whole city. You're working in the Jewish community, but you come from sort of every corner of this community, from arts and from academic and from civic. What's the sense that you have in Philadelphia about this notion of poverty? It has always been on the margin, right? We always talk about those people, but they've never been these people. And so do you sense that things are shifting? Do you believe that the work that we're doing in crisis is creating, as I said, as I asked Billy, a shift in the way people look at this question of poverty?
I do, and I think there are many layers to this, but I think the one thing that has happened, particularly for philanthropy and for anyone involved in this, is that we are seeing the impact of what we're doing in real time. It's not theoretical. It's not what are we going to find out over the next 3 years. It is that these are the people that need our help today and now. And they are seeing their dollars, their contributions. I'm thinking about the food source providers in Philadelphia who have doubled down with us and our food pantries that serve both kosher and non-kosher food. And that has been really, I think, inspiring for the overall philanthropic and civic communities and bringing people together, because we have to. And I think that the underlying issues, and you're right, my career has been spent dealing with many serious civic issues in all kinds of ways. And there are thousands of people and millions, if not billions of dollars that have been focused on all this for a long time. But this moment in time has amplified it in a way that we cannot look away from it. And we have seen that we're able to begin to address it. But as a conversation that some of us have been having, you know, we had this immediate emergency, and then we are now in this relief, and we don't know what the recovery is and if there's going to be emergency again. So, you know, in terms of like the whole community coming together, I think we really now know we can react to these kinds of emergencies, but need to be recovering while we're responding at the same time.
I think the point is very powerful, Melissa, because I guess we would move from concern to despair if in the face of a crisis as plain and pervasive as this one, there wasn't an ability to create some kind of communal response. But all the speakers so far have indicated a deep conviction that this isn't like a storm that the next day it's a sunny day and we can begin to rebuild and life sort of goes back to normal. You acknowledge the pain, but you think, okay, that's an event. This is not an event. This is a shift of reality. And so the question is, what are we doing within our organizations to create a different view of response, not an emergency response, but a response to an emergency that continues, like within a list, like ... It's still going on. And so I'm very curious to hear what you have to say about that. In context, I want to give you a question that we've got from people who are listening. Here's two, and feel free. One is a question: how can partnership that is happening in the moment between the NGO world and the philanthropy world? There's good things. Billy talked about 100,000 new people bringing resource to share our strength. The question is, how are you going to capitalize that? How does that go from an income statement to a balance sheet kind of relationship? And there's a question from Gil Frank, who's asking, how do we evaluate the impact that we need to return to charitable operation and the long-term impact on the disinvested community that we're trying to serve? Meaning, I understand Gil's question to be, we are, right, Alex, you said, here's a kosher community that doesn't have food, here's food. But what's the more long-term relationship that we want with these communities? Look, in the United States, for sure, right? We have a COVID crisis and we have a racial justice upheaval, right? And so this question of agency, do you hear me? Do you see me? Do I have agency? Thank you for the food, but do you see me? Do you hear me? And can I be part of the conversation going forward? Let me go around this way. I'll start with Alex, then I'm going to go to Eran, Melissa, and Billy to conclude. So Alex, first, as you see fit.
Sure. Well, we are really pivoting right now in the work that we're doing at the Federation. I'm sure many on this call, if you're a provider, are thinking along the same lines. Whereas we are still in a state of distress, we're not in the crisis mode that we once were, and we're moving towards recovery. And recovery is all about empowerment and looking at the long-term solutions that people will need in order to become self-sufficient. So at this moment, it's less about emergency food distribution and making sure that the channels that we had talked about earlier are covered where there are great disparities. Rather, to say, if you have lost your job, if you're not in a place where you feel like you can make your own payments on your necessities, we want to help you. New York City is about to likely will face a huge eviction crisis. And so we're thinking very deeply about how to ensure in every community that we touch, there is an easy way to access both employment services, financial counseling, legal support, primarily eviction prevention, as well as access to emergency food. So whereas in crisis, as you say, we were making food possible in every mechanism we could imagine. Now we want to say to people with a sense of dignity and to empower them, let's lift you up. What are the building blocks we need to put into place? And if you need food along the way, we're quietly going to be there to ensure that the gap is filled.
Beautiful. That's amazing. Eran, how does that strike you? Because I know Alex is speaking your language. What do you have to say?
First of all, in terms of resources, thanks to some people, bodies, federations, and foundations also that participate in this convention, and also thanks to the Israeli public and private sector, we will able to increase our response and to help many people in Israel that feel that now in distress. You know, many NGOs says that there is a decrease in their donations. We don't feel that way right now, but we are worried about 2021 because we know that it's a long journey. Now, in terms of our organization, there are many questions that we are asking. First of all, we ask ourselves what we need to stop what we need to start, what we need to continue, what we need to change. And I give 2 examples. One is that we are an umbrella organization. We are a national food bank, but in this crisis, we delivered and distributed food directly to the front door of many elderly people. So we ask ourselves, is this pandemic has to change our philosophy of how we work? Another question, if we dealt with elderly in the first time that we had the outbreak, now during these 6 months, we discovered that the poor, the families are that we are helping, their situation is very bad. And more than that, there are about 30% of people who are approaching us are new families who approach for the first time in their lives. And we had a survey in Latet discovering that when the people from a medium class lose their income, their main income, they can deteriorate to poverty, to deep poverty, within 13 to 21 months. So it's very fragile, and we know that we need to shape new intervention to meet the needs of those new, unfortunately poor, corona poor, that we are going to meet within the next few months.
Beautiful. Melissa, your thoughts about how this progresses?
So in thinking about how it progresses, I actually want to take a big step back. And one thing that we've been talking a lot is that Jewish federations were built for this.
Yep.
That this is why we're here. And that we existed to serve Jewish communities that were in need. And if you go through every decade of the last century plus, you will see this is another crisis, and it is huge. But we have faced these things before, and we will face them in the future, and that's why we're here. And I think that for many of us, we've been in our cycle of what we're supporting our communities and the things that we do, and now we are like, this is it. And it's actually making our communities also recognize it in a different way. And it is building relationships and rebuilding and reforming how we can all be working together as we move forward. So but the other thing that I just wanted to add back into what everyone has been saying in terms of the ecosystem is what Eran was just talking about, which is that many of the people that are in need now have never had to ask for help with food. They might not even know that there's a mitzvah food pantry or the services. They are not on our Jewish Children and Family Services client list for mental health services, the list goes on and on. And I think one of the bigger issues for us, and while the ecosystem in terms of government and funding and federations and philanthropies, is also how it is that we are providing access to all of these needs and people understanding how that they can be connected to what they need.
I appreciate that very much, Melissa, and I appreciate the perspective because sweep of time matters. Eran, I'm counting to 30. Ready, set, go.
So, something maybe we missed. This conference, we are in the world of big data, and we know that we share similar challenges in Philadelphia, in New York, in Los Angeles, in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem. And I think this is, maybe we take this opportunity that if we need next time, we can share, our thoughts maybe during or before and speaking to each other together, because I think that this is how we can do better because we can learn from you, and maybe sometimes you can also learn from us. Thank you.
I appreciate that very much. Billy, last word, your view of tell me where this goes. You've been at this for a while, my friend, and you've seen these cycles. So how do you feel this plays?
Well, I guess that's up to us. It depends a lot on how we play it and whether we're courageous enough and bold enough and risk-taking enough to play it the way we need to. When I was speaking earlier about having more permission, I think it's really a permission to educate. Melissa just made this great point about awareness. 40% of the people who are getting food assistance now in the US are getting it for the first time in their lives. We saw at the early days of the pandemic, there was this kind of iconic photo in San Antonio of 10,000 families in their cars lined up at the food bank. Nobody ever realized that many Americans were hungry before. Our focus has been childhood hunger. And one of the things that we see as an opportunity to get across now, And no, I've never met anybody who's against feeding a hungry child. But the best thing that we can do to support many of these kids is to strengthen their families and to support their parents or their caregivers. The politics around that in the past have typically broken down. So again, an opportunity to educate there. And then finally, I'm thinking about a call I had about a month ago from one of our most generous stakeholders and a really smart guy. And he said, I noticed you've been talking a lot lately about structural racism and race equity. What does that have to do with hunger? And I thought, well, shame on us, shame on me for not doing a better job of explaining that, because, you know, we work at this full time and he dips in and out of it, this particular donor. So if we haven't done a good job of explaining how issues of race and racial justice relate to hunger and poverty, then we've got more work to do. And again, I think we've got the permission to do it. The question is whether we'll have the courage to do it.
I want to say, in conclusion to the panelists, thank you. Based on the volume of questions that I got on the WhatsApp from the team, you provoked a lot of thinking, which is precisely what I hoped. We all hoped would happen. And I want to say personally to each of you in the different worlds that you work, the hungry that you feed and the naked that you clothe and the brokenhearted that you assuage. Those are my parents. Those are my friends. Those are my children. Those are my grandchildren. I am deeply grateful to you for all that you do on behalf of people who don't otherwise have a voice. And so for granting them a voice, be blessed and feel it. I wish you each and all a happy and a healthy new year. Ketiv v'chatima tova, be written and be sealed for goodness in the new year to come, with lots of love from Jerusalem. Kyle, back to you.
Shana tova.
Shana tova.
Shana tova.
Thank you, Jeff and speakers. That was a fascinating panel. Food access was, of course, a central issue for many during this crisis, but for the elderly and for Holocaust survivors, it was just one of many concerns. Our elders were by far the most impacted by this crisis. Within a matter of days, they became isolated, losing much of their support system. Reimagining ways to care for the elderly and for Holocaust survivors was a great challenge and is the topic of our next panel. I'm honored to introduce our exceptional panelists, individuals who have dedicated their life and expertise to care for our elders. Please welcome Joel Greenberg, a lawyer by trade who previously worked in the Office of Special Investigations, locating and deporting Nazi war criminals who entered the United States. Joel is the co-founder of Seed the Dream Foundation, a foundation that has held a deep focus on helping survivors maintain their dignity in the later years of their life. During the COVID-19 crisis, Seed the Dream Foundation has supported survivors across Israel and the United States and continue to do so. Yael Eckstein is the president and CEO of the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews and has the rare distinction of being a woman leading one of the world's largest religious, not-for-profit organizations. The fellowship is one of the largest philanthropic organizations in Israel, providing humanitarian aid to hundreds of thousands of Israelis and Jews worldwide. Since the outbreak of COVID-19, the fellowship has dedicated $20 million for emergency relief programs and has also donated life-saving equipment to hospitals throughout Israel. Ronnie Dueck, a seasoned social entrepreneur, was among the first to identify the low level of preparedness to care for the elderly during this crisis. In response, he founded Vishamarta, an emergency campaign to rescue the elderly population and prevent the collapse of the Israeli healthcare system. Stuart Kaplan, CEO of Self-Help, led the organization in the delicate and challenging mission of adapting their operations almost overnight to continue the provision of services to 20,000 vulnerable elderly and Holocaust survivors at home. A special thank you to David Shizer, who has agreed to moderate this distinguished panel. We are extremely happy to have you with us today. David is the Dean Emeritus of Columbia Law School and the former CEO of JDC. David, the floor is yours.
Michal, thank you. I'm David Shizer from Columbia Law School. I had the honor of serving as CEO of the Joint Distribution Committee. I have the particular honor today of moderating a very distinguished panel. Our topic is the crisis that COVID-19 has precipitated for elderly people in Israel and in New York. It makes a lot of sense to have a panel that focuses on Israel and New York together. And obviously one of the reasons is the close ties between the communities. Like Eric Goldstein, you mentioned this before, I also have a daughter who's just finished her quarantine in Israel. The communities are close, we care about each other. But I think even more importantly, as this whole day has shown, there's a lot that we can learn from each other. There's innovation, there's creativity, there's commitment in both places. And by sharing those ideas, we can do better and do more. And in fact, we were just saying earlier that we wish this had been a panel where we were reflecting on a job well done. And instead it's a panel where we're in the midst of the challenges, thinking together about how to do better. We have a magnificent and distinguished panel to discuss these issues. Couldn't have done better on that score, in my opinion. We have Yael Eckstein, for example, the leader of IFCJ. I know from personal experience, working with the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews, their intense and complete commitment to helping Holocaust survivors and other elderly Jews across the world. We have Ronnie Dweck, a prominent business leader in Israel, a social entrepreneur who has launched a new venture in response to the crisis to help with geriatric care facilities. We have Stuart Kaplan, who leads Self-Help Community Services, one of the leading human service organizations in New York. They care for 20,000 elderly people in New York every year. And we'll turn to them in a minute, but first we're going to hear from the co-founder of the Seed the Dream Foundation, Joel Greenberg. He's going to offer introductory remarks on the critical needs of the Holocaust survivor population during the COVID-19 crisis. So Joel, thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah. Thank you very much, David. Appreciate it. So that was, I'm going to keep my remarks brief for about 7 minutes because there's many inspiring speakers after me. I'm mainly going to address survivors living in poverty, both here in Israel, where I am now, as well as in the US and in New York. And when I think of the phrase survivors living in poverty, that really should be an oxymoron, but sadly it's not. Of the 300,000 plus survivors that are still alive today, spread around the world, at least 1/3, or over 100,000, are living in poverty. And for the people who have suffered more than any of us can imagine, the fact that near the end of their lives, the average age is about 85, that they're going without basic necessities like food, medicine, rent at times, nursing care, is just a total shame. And it's something I think that we as a society, we as a community are truly failing at. That this is occurring at the end of their lives. And I believe that anyone who thinks that we're not failing really does not understand the facts of what's happening. So in March 2019, there were about 30,000 of the 80,000 survivors that were alive in the US were living in poverty. In Israel, about somewhere around 30 or 40% of the 185,000 survivors in Israel are living at or in poverty. So those numbers were pre-COVID, and obviously we haven't taken a poll or survey what's happening post-COVID. But if you look at the definition of a failure, that by itself is a failure. And if you had a classroom where 30, 40% of the students couldn't read, we'd all agree that that teacher, that school system was failing. So for us, it's really sadly a silent crisis because it's really not on many people's radar screens. Thankfully, it is on the radar screens of the people on this call, and particularly the speakers on the call. And which is not to say that organizations like Latet and Self-Help are not doing a great job and punching way above their weight. They are, and I think the work they're doing is admirable. But I'm really speaking as a society, as a community, we are not doing nearly enough. So, and Clearly, the needs of the survivors have been exacerbated through the pandemic. And as you can imagine, survivors in the scope, in terms of a lockdown, are at greatest risk. Before the pandemic hit, survivors had to choose between food, heat, medicine, or rent. The basic needs were not being met. Now, survivors who are cut off from their families, isolated because of the risk of COVID, are even suffering more and more than we could ever have imagined. They're isolated in their homes and they're confined. This has created a massive surge of new needs and correspondingly new risks. There have been networks of volunteers, day centers, social programmings, and many of those that were in existence had to grind to a halt because of COVID. And survivors, where they typically could turn to places for help, those places, because of COVID, were shut down. As I said before, the average age of the survivors is over 85, and they need urgent help with food, medicine, and basic home care, as well as clearly emotional and social support. For many survivors, there's an added level of complexity and urgency. Trauma, as you all can imagine, was great early in their life, and now it's being revisited upon them as they become isolated, socially isolated, and also physically isolated to a greater degree than they ever could imagine once they survived the Shoah. There have been efforts of late to aid the survivors during COVID. Hotlines have been established in Israel and the US. Call centers were established, but clearly their needs are not being met. What used to be in-person care has now become telephone calls. Checking on survivors, which was once regularly done by volunteers visiting their homes, now has to be done by phone, and it's certainly not a substitute for the loneliness and isolation they feel. Food services, which were delivering food to the survivors, had to be completely changed because of the risk of COVID for both the survivor and the volunteers. And that added an additional expense to the efforts to help survivors, many of whom needed food on a daily basis because of the dire economic circumstances they were in before COVID struck. Items that may not have taken priority before, such as hearing aids, internet access, now became critical for the survivors' needs. For the past number of years, probably going back 6, 7, or 8 years, my wife and I have been working through our foundation, Seed the Dream, to galvanize the philanthropic community, motivate governments, and move resources to raise awareness and address the needs of survivors. We have seen that need grow exponentially over the past 6 months. We created an initiative called Kavod Chef, Survivors of the Holocaust Emergency Fund in the United States, that we're now operating in over 30 communities in the US, including New York. What we have done is establish an initiative where we created a national fund of donors that will match local donors. So every dollar that the local community comes up with is basically matched on a 3-to-1 ratio. So we're able to provide a great deal of food, money for rent, money for heat, money for air conditioning, money for nursing care, all the things that these survivors do not nearly have enough of. We've also created a similar structure in Israel, and one of the organizations, Latet, is forefront of that organization to help us serve the needs of the survivors in Israel. Services were increased and expanded to meet the needs as a result. Partners like Latet have been working across Israel to be responsive to the additional needs and raising awareness to the great problems survivors are facing through forums like this and conversations like we're having today. Home care needs alone have exceeded any resource that's available. Our survivors need us, they need solutions, they need us to come together, to work together, to place an emphasis on addressing their needs today. While the response to the pandemic, particularly as it pertains to survivors, has been admirable, it's not nearly enough. We must ensure that we remain focused on increasing services and answering the needs of our survivors during this critical time. Before COVID struck, we said time was of the essence. With the pandemic only heightening the emergency and basic needs, the time is now running out. We have no time to waste. We as a foundation continue to be ready to match any philanthropic dollars, any philanthropic dollars from any source in Israel and the United States to raise additional funds to meet the needs of the survivors in either Israel or in the United States. I would urge you to contact us through Latet if you are interested in donating any amount of money to help with this initiative. So now I'm ready to turn this over to the panel. I'm looking forward to hearing all that's being done and all that can be done. Thank you very much for your time and for any additional support you can provide to the survivors. Thank you.
Joel, thank you so much for those eloquent words and for everything that you and Seed the Dream are doing on this important issue. Needless to say, the Claims Conference is a key resource for Holocaust survivors. They do a lot. They distribute about $900 million a year, but they would also tell you that it's not enough, that more needs to be done. And the energy and commitment of Joel, people like you, others on this call, on our panel, it's critical. So turning to one of those key people, Yael. I have been, as I said, personally a witness and a partner for the wonderful work that IFCJ does on behalf of elderly Jews all over the world. So this is very much part of your mission, but at the same time, unless you're very different from the rest of us, this is a situation that perhaps you and your colleagues didn't anticipate. COVID is just an unusual, it's a crazy situation, required lots of pivoting, lots of changes. Maybe you can tell us a bit about how you had to sort of turn on a dime in order to address these critical needs.
Thank you so much, David. It's wonderful to be with such an amazing group of panelists today. Yes, like you've said, it's been difficult times for everyone. And I think that the fellowship was uniquely set up because, as I always say, I think nonprofits need to function like a business. You have to have a clear strategic plan, a clear mission statement, have to have very clear goals, and we have to all be focused, all of us, our staff, our board, our donors, and the entire world on meeting those needs. But we also always need to stay flexible. And so as the fellowship had our 5-year strategic plan, which was very much focused on providing basic needs, we're in a unique position because for the past 35 years, we've been focusing on how to strategically and effectively distribute those basic needs. And so when COVID struck, we immediately were able to continue our strategic plans, but create new goals, KPIs, deliverables in order to get to the aid to this new population that needed it in a way that would be most effective for them. And so within the first 2 weeks, we distributed to elderly who are in their homes over 30,000 food packages. We had volunteers calling up every single elderly that we've helped to make sure that they knew that they weren't alone, because just as much as the physical needs are so exaggerated right now in the lives of so many individuals, it's also those emotional needs that you mentioned of elderly suddenly not being able to go to their elderly clubs, not being able to go and meet with their friends. And so as soon as the crisis hit, the fellowship established a $20 million emergency COVID fund where we continued our ongoing operations and really acted in faith that our donors would come through, mostly Christian donors, to provide that additional $20 million to the people who need it most. And we very much believe in partnerships. And so we've partnered with the government of Israel to get them to allocate over 70 million shekel in basic needs that the fellowship is distributing for them. We've partnered with Latet, an amazing organization doing so much in the area of food and helping the elderly, along with the business sector organizations like Matan, where it's really the nonprofit, the for-profit, and the government coming together to meet the new needs that arise. within that, those are all the donors, but there are so many individuals who are so dedicated to doing good on the ground that I very much believe in working with municipal social workers who are our hands and feet on the ground, who see the needs every single day, who have access to the people who need it most, and yet they don't have the funds and the ability to distribute the needs that they see every day, like a new bed, like food, like paying the electric bill, specifically for these elderly during the most difficult times. And so I think it's really partnership between those who are in a position to give effectively, strategically, with the social workers, the soldiers, the volunteers, who are all available and wanting to help, that we don't replicate what's being done as far as administrative, rather we work in partnership. And the last thing that I would say is we have to immediately shift not only to who we distribute the aid to, but how we distribute the aid. So maybe instead of giving food boxes, we've been able to give food cards. We've been distributing applications over cell phones for people to pay their electricity bill. We are bringing prepared food boxes to elderly because they can no longer leave their homes. And even soup kitchens who have seen a significant increase of people who are asking them for aid yet can't get to the soup kitchens. We've been able to donate close to a dozen refrigerated vans to soup kitchens so that they can bring those meals to the families and elderly who need it most. So I would sum it up by saying it's all about strategy, goals, and partnerships.
Yeah, thank you, and Kola Kabod. One of the key sources of success in the philanthropic sector is that in addition to acting from our hearts, we have to think with our heads. And the account that you just gave of the very flexible response by FCJ is just it's a case study in that. So Ronnie, let's turn to you. You are one of Israel's well-known philanthropists. You've done so much for the country, but if I'm not mistaken, I think this focus on the basic needs of elderly is a somewhat new one for you. And I think the reason is obvious. You recognized a critically important crisis, particularly at geriatric centers, and you stepped in and you launched something amazing. Maybe you can tell us a bit about what motivated you to do that and what you did.
Thank you, David. Well, we were saying before the panel started that at the moment we're in Israel going not from chaos to relief, but from relief to chaos. And that's quite a critical time. So I will try and give a little bit of background on how we got to working with the elderly. I'll just say that in the last 2 or 2.5 decades, my friends and I, with a lot of wonderful professionals, have been trying to change the culture of giving in Israel from a sporadic giving to more professional and target-oriented initiatives. And through Shitufim and Zionist 2002 infrastructural organization we've created in the late 90s, we have worked really hard to bring the nonprofit and the civil society to the same level of intervention with and a dialogue or trialogue with the government and with the business sector. 2 examples of initiative we've done in the last few years under what we call collective impact, actually bringing all stakeholders, government, nonprofit, and business working together. One was the 5x2 educational initiative. As you know, we always say that the man in the tank is more important than the tank in Israel. And we were having the curve of kids taking 5 units in maths going down from year to year, major calamity for the high-tech and for the intelligence in the army. And I will not go into detail now, but within 5 years, we doubled the numbers of kids who actually are taking our 5 units in maths. And this is really the most important assets Israel's got. The second initiative that brings us closer to the geriatric intervention, we realized 5 years ago that every year in Israel, between 4,000 to 6,000 people dies from infectious diseases in the hospital. Yes, most of them are elderly, but there are kids and youngsters and others. Hospitals in Israel became death traps. And it's more than all the terrorism and accident and car accident put together. We went with the same type of methods of collective impact into 2 hospitals, the biggest hospital in the Middle East, or one of the biggest, Tel HaShomer, and Nahariya, another smaller hospital in the north who deals with major problem with a lot of refugees coming from Syria. And we were able, within 2 years, to reduce by half people dying, death from infectious diseases in the worst, in the most difficult internal department in those hospitals. Again, I won't go now into the methods, but when we started facing COVID-19 in March, I was asking myself, what can I do as an individual far and above of my activities within the nonprofit? And the first call I did was Professor Itzik Rice, who's the Director General of Tel HaShomer, to whom I have a lot of respect. And I said, Itzik, I would like to donate $1 million for equipment or whatever you need to stop that terrible thing from spreading. And he said, I'd love to take your money now for an exam machine for the emergency ward for COVID. But Ronnie, you and your friend should do something about stopping the spread of COVID-19 within the geriatric institution, because if that's gonna, if we're gonna lose control there, the entire health system in Israel is gonna collapse. And this is what I'm worried from. And I was very surprised the first time in my, I would say, non-profit career, where I came to donate money to an official or whatever, and he told me give the money somewhere else. When he said that, the second call was to the Director General of the Ichilov Hospital, Ronnie Gamzo, and I said, Ronnie, that's what Itzik Rice told me. And he told me, yes, he's right. That's where you should put your efforts, because if we're going to lose control there, that's the end of the story. Within a few days, I put together the head of our National Initiative Fund, Zionist 2000, and the Shitufim. We sat together and we put together a plan whereby we recruited within 3 or 4 days the top ex-head of logistics in the army, the lady who was running behavior control sciences in the army, two guys who were dealing with crisis management, again, within the military service. And we took the entire voluntary organization of Acharai, young guys who goes to the development and do work. So they were 300 of them were representative within 312 geriatric institutions. We realized from a very quick survey that all the institutions were not equipped, did not have any norms and procedure on what to do with elderly who are actually contaminated with COVID-19. And within 2 weeks, with the help of my friend Gil Schwait from Checkpoint, and later on from the Scheinberg Foundation, who gave us $5 million to this effort, we recruited about 30 million shekel within 2 weeks. In Israel, it's a lot of money. And we actually, within less than a month, fully equipped the 312 geriatric institution in Israel. The residents, 25,000 residents, and 12,000 caregiver. The second thing we did is we were trying to analyze what are the main problems that they are facing, and we realized that there's a huge problem of staff. So we started a dialogue with the head of the immigration authority in Israel and convinced them to take some of the refugees in Israel who are allowed to work in restaurants and convert them to work now into the geriatric institution. We started to have a special, create a standard to all the geriatric institutions on what do you do when you have a COVID case. How do you actually get visits, in neutral area, visit of the families to the elderly who are suffering terribly from loneliness. So all that happened within the last 3 or 4 months. And we had representatives within the mother and father umbrella organization that the government has created for the elderly, and within the Mossad headquarters in Tel HaShomer was actually involved in purchasing. They were seeing, we were telling them what needs to be done within the institution. And I must say that we were actually collaborating, and we had representative of the Ministry of Health and Social Care within our organization. So that's what we've been doing for the last 6 months. And it's been tough, but very rewarding, I must say.
Wow, Ronnie, so impressive. Toda raba. Stuart, now let's turn to you. We've gotten 2 really important and interesting perspectives from Israel, and now we turn to New York, where your organization is a key provider of human services to elderly. You've done this for a while, but again, you had to pivot, you had to make changes. This is a very different situation. Please tell us what you've done and how it's going. And I think you're on mute.
One of the problems of being on mute, I agree. Thank you, David, and to my colleagues. Yeah, self-help was born out of the atrocity of the Holocaust some 85 years ago, which makes all things relative, even a pandemic. And yes, New York was hit quick, it was hit hard, it was hit early. And so the experiences that others were able to have maybe weeks or months after, New York was not there. And indeed, as Ronnie has just talked about, wanting to help and support the hospitals, all of the focus, 99% of it, was on the hospitals, the acute care system in New York, which made organizations like Self-Help, a human services organization that cares for people in the community in their own homes, no nursing homes, no hospitals. That whole population was invisible in the early stages. People did not realize or think about those who were being taken care of at home. And for self-help, that is the elderly and Holocaust survivors. So that is where the challenges truly began, is trying to care for people and provide protection for people and safety of those who were not really a priority in the very early stages. Something I speak about often is ageism. And in that context, this was ageism to the max. People were not thinking about the 75-year-old, 85-year-old, 95-year-old, even 100-year-old, of course, when it came to this. Made it very difficult in the early stages. But as an organization, Self-Help immediately realized that we are taking care of an elderly population, and safety, and this might sound a little bit odd for the moment since we're talking about clients and protecting the elderly, but safety of our staff was one of our very first, in the first 24 or 48 hours, areas that we focused on. Without the staff, without the human resources, the clients would not be receiving their services. And Self-Help is caring for 20,000 clients you mentioned, 5,000 of whom are Holocaust survivors, but we have 2,000 staff members that are providing those services. So we needed to focus on them. And the second area we had focus on was our fiscal stability, because then without the funds, of course, and not just that for us to have the funds, but for those who support us, are they able to provide the funds to ensure that we will be able to survive? As an NGO, we receive a lot of funds from government grants, from philanthropy, and we needed to turn, within the first 48 hours, we contacted virtually every government funding source, every philanthropic source, every grantor, to find out if they were functioning and if they would be able to continue to fund us. Included in those are, of course, UJA Federation, Claims Conference, and Seed the Dream. Thank you very much to Joel. And without exception, government, philanthropy, all immediately responded and said yes. And not only that, we are going to increase or advance more quickly the funds that you are receiving. Somebody made reference to crisis and being in crisis and how we react. The entire ecosystem reacted, and we are, delighted, obviously, with that, and that is what gave us the support to continue. We also have, I heard the phrase before, if you're ready the day before, you're ready the day of. For 364 days a year, Self-Help has systems in place that help us to identify if there is a crisis. Nobody anticipated a pandemic. We think more about snowstorms. We think about transportations and strikes and things like that. But if there is a crisis, how will we be able to get to the people most in need? So a triage system exists 364 days a year for that last day. And we have priorities, a staging, of course. And so while we did have to freeze the home care visits of social workers, also referenced earlier, so that the in-home service was not available and everybody went to phone calls and we're making tens of thousands of phone calls, we do have a large home care services at Self-Help. And we provide millions of hours of home care. This is for people who are physically in need at home and need assistance. And those are prioritized in terms of the greatest need and lesser need. And with immediate response of PPE, which as everybody knows was essential but not available, again, going to the priorities, all the PPE was going to the acute care system, not to systems where people were going at home. But around the country and then around the world within the early weeks, I don't even want to say a month, within 2 weeks, we had access to the PPE so that we can provide safety to those people on our staff who were going into people's homes. And that continued. There was a fall off from both sides. We had staff who were concerned about going into a senior's home because COVID may exist in the home. And then we had clients who were concerned about having staff members come in because they may be bringing it in. Slowly that has begun to turn now, six months into this, but slowly it has begun to turn. But nevertheless, over 85% of our clients were continued to be served. So 85% of 3 million hours of service have continued through this. The other very important funding that we have year-round but grew as a result of COVID were emergency cash assistance. And I think Yael spoke to this as well. The immediate needs for, to address food insecurity, sanitizers, deliveries, even if somebody needed to get to an emergency visit, taxi cabs or Uber visits was all paid for through the generosity of philanthropy and donors to us who have provided over $1 million in funding for emergency cash assistance. And so we have been able to maintain that, which is a very individual need, client by client.
Stuart, that is extremely impressive, very difficult effort. In just a couple of minutes we have left, I'd like to ask each of you, and it's unfair because I'm asking for brief thoughts about a very broad question, but some brief thoughts about what we can expect going forward. This is a constantly evolving situation. There are new needs, there are challenges. Yael, maybe we can start with you. What do you think we should be expecting? What are you most focusing on for the future?
Well, I think it really comes down to 3 different populations that we've identified that we're going to continue to see the increase in urgent requests from these 3 populations. And that's number 1, the elderly. Number 2, the new poor, families who are living month to month, but being able to get by without being registered with the welfare department, without needing to turn to anyone for help. That suddenly now they're in position of crisis. And we're going to continue to see more of the need to provide emergency basic needs for those once totally functional families. And the third is the younger generation. We, for example, going up to Rosh Hashanah, the fellowship is distributing over 150,000 food parcels. And what we saw today at one of the food distributions in Lud, I go every year, it's usually elderly, almost all elderly. And I got a call today from one of my colleagues in the field who said, Yael, I've never seen anything like this. They're all families. There are so many young people here. And so I think, I guess you didn't ask, but I'm going to anyways tell you how I think that we have to really meet this challenge is by partnering. As I hear all of these amazing people on the panel, and I hear daily from other organizations that are working in the field 24/7, I think that now is the time that as the nonprofit world, we have to let go of our ego, let go of our brand, let go of our logo if we even need to, in order to work together in collaboration in order to reach more people, to really remember why we're here. And it's not for our own individual budget. It's not for our own annual report. It's not just to see those numbers increase, but it's in order to get to the aid the people that need it most. And so just taking those three populations as one small example, is that for the new poor, the fellowship has partnered with Matan to provide needs to the new poor. For the elderly, we're partnering with the government. And for the elderly, we continue to partner with organizations like Latet and so many others in order to get the aid to the people who need it most. So I think, to sum it up, there are so many people that we're going to see in the next year that need help, and the only way that we're going to be able to meet those needs is by partnering.
Yael, well said, and I certainly think mission over brand is a lesson that cannot be taught often enough. It's critical for every nonprofit. So thank you for emphasizing that point. Ronnie, if we can turn to you, what do you expect in the next few weeks? What's most on your mind? What are you trying to accomplish?
Well, I think that at the moment, there's a big lack of trust between in general, lack of trust between the Israeli citizens and the government. And that comes down also to the management and the staff of the geriatric institution, who felt the first stage that they were neglected. It's very nice for a non-profit initiative to come and help them, but they were expecting, and we're talking about a lot of Holocaust survivors. The geriatric institution is the lower, is in the end of the line of the level-wise of the institution in Israel for the elderly. And they were expecting to have more work at the time. We are in the process now of creating a standard mark that it will be acceptable on both the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Social Affairs, in coordination with Israel Maimon. Professor Maimon is responsible for the Mother and Father Authority, who deal with the elderly. And that standard mark will deal with equipping, care, visits, staffing, loneliness, all the issues that came out over the last 6 months that we were able to actually sort out under a lot of pressure, but sort out and create those standard marks. So we want to formalize it. The second thing is, we know these days, that the major calamity in the geriatric institution is that the elderly get contaminated by the staff. So we need today to increase the number of testing for the staff, because this is what's going to keep our elderly safe. And this is something that we've been discussing with the ministries and with Israel Maimon, and hopefully we're putting a lot of pressure on that. And obviously, we distribute over 1 million masks and 1 million gels and 700 or 800,000 protective uniforms to the staff over the last 6 months. Government has to take this responsibility. They're doing it now. They're actually doing it now. And we hope they're going to continue. But on the long term, I would say that we as an infrastructural organization who believe in collective impact as a method, want to take now the elderly in general to do a national initiative over the next 2 or 3 years, whereby we will look at employment, loneliness, cares, because the problem with the geriatric institution is a byproduct of a huge neglect of this big population who's getting older and older and nobody cares for in general. So I think that if we look at the big picture in an holistic way on how we deal in the next year with the elderly population in Israel, there's an economical issue there, there's a social issue, there's a human issue. And because we're all going to get there one day, right? So it's a personal issue. So we need to do that. And that's where Shitufim is going in the next 2 or 3 years as a result of what we did in the last 6 months.
Tony, thank you. And Stuart, same question for you. What is worrying you the most about the coming weeks, and what are you hoping to do about it?
Well, out of crisis comes innovation. And one of the things for the older adults is isolation. Everybody is concerned about social isolation for everybody, not just older adults, but for older adults, even more pronounced. And many years ago, Self-Help in partnership with Microsoft created something called a virtual senior center. It essentially is an interactive platform that allows a group of people to get together, just like we are together today on the screen, with a facilitator that could be in Israel, could be in the museum, or could be teaching a yoga class. And those classes have become, and that center has become, a lifeline for right now over 600 seniors throughout New York and in other states as well. And we want to address social isolation in this crisis, and I believe we will learn out of the crisis so that it becomes a staple for people who are socially isolated. And so our virtual senior center is something that we are right now trying to grow, seeking funding for, and has become a solution to combat social isolation, which leads to mental health, depression, and then physical health and other costs and bad healthcare issues for an older population. So we are trying to address that issue at self-help, and we would love to do it in partnership with friends in Israel if there is anybody out there who would like to be in touch.
And Joel, I wonder if I can pose this question to you, and that really is, given your passion for your survivors, the focus that you provide in their well-being, do you have thoughts about what especially worries you in the coming weeks and what you'd especially like to see happen? I think you may have answered us already, and feel free to refer to the really worthwhile financial initiative you mentioned, or perhaps something else.
Yeah, so thank you. So what I see in terms of aid for survivors and taking care of survivors is it's actually going to create a more dire circumstance for those survivors, because governments are going to be under pressure, which they are, to help many more people who have been greatly affected by the pandemic. Foundations are going to be greatly affected by and inundated with requests, not just for survivors. So as the governments and foundations can give less to survivors or focus less on survivors because they're being asked to help so many, understandably so, the situation for survivors is going to get worse. I'm just being very frank and brutal about that. Survivors are not on many people's radar screens. And the problem as that occurs is that the survivors, they don't have a large political voice. They don't have a large social movement, or many, as we discussed, are homebound. So there's really no one to speak for the survivors. The amount of funds going towards the survivors is going to be less and less. I can give an example that, for example, in Israel, survivors were being asked to choose between adult diapers and nursing aid, with the insane logic that if you have a nurse who can take you to the bathroom, why would you need an adult diaper? Or why would you need an adult diaper if you have a nurse? So those are the type of dilemmas that they're asking survivors to choose, and to think what they had to choose as they went through and survived the Shoah. Now they're being asked to choose between diapers or a nurse's aid. It's not right. So all I would say is that the philanthropic, in everyone's philanthropic portfolio, there has to be a portion allocated to survivors. We're all being inundated. We're all helping as much as possible. But for survivors to be forgotten at this point in their lives, I think, again, as I started my remarks, is just a failure of society, and particularly failure of the governments, and failure of the Jewish community. So in terms of what Seed the Dream is doing, is that for every dollar that's raised, we will match that dollar in Israel or in the United States, in particular programs for emergency aid for survivors. So it's all we can do. We can only do what we can do, and we're trying to do as much as possible.
And I can attest to the amazing work that they're doing, because the fellowship has actually partnered with Seed the Dream to provide $500,000 worth of emergency buttons to Holocaust survivors during this emergency situation. So I am firsthand saying what a difference Joel and his family are making in Israel.
Yeah, we greatly appreciate your match there, and it really it's going to mean a great deal to almost 10,000 survivors who are about to have their panic buttons taken away from them. So if they fell, particularly as isolated as they are, there would be no one to know that they had fallen. So what you're doing is a true mitzvah, and we thank you a great deal.
And I would like to join in offering my thanks to my colleagues on this distinguished panel, not just for their participation, but for the amazing work that each of them and their colleagues are doing to deal with an incredibly unique and difficult problem. And I want to extend that thanks to all of you who've tuned in to have this conversation with us. Needless to say, the work goes on, and thank you all.
Thank you, David.
Thank you so much, David.
Thank you, David.
Great job.
Thank you very
Thank
much,
you.
David.
Thank you.
Thank you all for this inspiring and insightful conversation, and thank you for the work that you do for our elders. Over the course of this crisis, we have learned that accurate and efficient management of the crisis required a tailored response for every population group. This was notably the case with the ultra-Orthodox community, both in the US and in Israel. In our next discussion, we chose to focus on some of the day-to-day heroes of this crisis who work in the field and hear what they believe were the key factors in successfully addressing the challenges of COVID-19. Please welcome Yehuda Morgenstern, CEO of the Bnei Brak Economic Development Corporation. As part of the leadership of Bnei Brak Municipality, Yehuda took an active role in the management of COVID-19 within his community. Rabbi Baruch Ber Bender, president of Achiezer, is one of the leading nonprofits working with the ultra-Orthodox populations in the New York area. Achiezer developed a unique model of operation that centralized social requests. Our moderator for this conversation is Yoav Heller. Yoav is the CEO of Ma'oz, one of the most important organizations in Israel in the field of leadership empowerment. Ma'oz was involved in some of the most important public sector initiatives during COVID-19. Yoav, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and hello from Lod, Israel, and good morning to all our friends across the ocean in the United States, and welcome to our virtual panel regarding the response of the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel and in the States to the COVID crisis. Thank you, Michal. And just I want to apologize that General Ronnie Numa, who is the head of the Israel mission to tackle COVID-19 in the ultra-Orthodox community, has been quarantined yesterday, hence cannot join us this discussion. I want to present our respected guests. I just want to introduce myself beforehand. My name is Yoav Heller. I'm the CEO of Ma'oz. Ma'oz is an organization that functions in Israel, and its mission is to create a network of cross-sector leaders that increase trust among Israeli society and create cross-sectoral solutions in healthcare, employment, education, and local government. In the COVID crisis, we dealt a lot in operation mode with the crisis in the ultra-Orthodox and the Arab community. And to our guests, I want to introduce Rabbi Baruch Ben Bender, who lives in the USS in the United States and is the president of Achiezer. Achiezer is one of the leading NGOs working with the Orthodox population in New York and develop unique models of operations through a call center of all kinds of social requests and redistribute it toward relevant bodies or solving the issues directly. And we'll get to Rabbi Ben Bender in a moment. And in Israel, in Bnei Brak, Yehuda Morgenstern. Yehuda is the CEO of Bnei Brak Economic Development Corporation. As part of the leadership of Bnei Brak Municipality, Yehuda took an active role in the management of the COVID crisis, and as a result, reached a very unique and insightful perspective on how Bnei Brak, which is the largest ultra-Orthodox city in Israel, how the community there faced the pandemic. So good morning and good afternoon, gentlemen. And I think we can begin with a statement that one, COVID is a challenge in both countries as we speak. And two, it's even a more unique challenge in the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel and in the States. So on that note, I would love you to share with us, what was the way that your community received COVID? By the way, in wave 1, and also now in the ongoing waves. And what were the obstacles in tackling and building models to tackle the crisis. And we'll start with that, and then we'll develop the conversation. So Rabbi Bender, why don't you begin?
So good morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be. Thank you, Yoel, for your kind introduction. And honestly, to jump right into your question as what were the initial challenges when COVID began, and I think that if I had to pinpoint one single word, it was probably communication. It was communication, the realization that we were dealing with something as difficult and as great as it was. So many different reports came in from so many different sources. It's going to be very bad. It's going to be horrible. It's like the flu. It's no big deal. I'm sure these are all the answers and responses you heard, whether you're in Israel, whether you're in America, no matter where you are. And I think that right at the beginning, we realized, when I say we, Achiezer, our team, our board, community rabbis, that the only way that we are going to be able to effectively, first of all, understand what we're dealing with, because you can't tackle a problem unless you know what you have in your hands. And we realized that the only way that's going to happen is if we get as much as possible on the same page to understand, whether it means putting together a medical task force or the rabbis in one phone call, one Zoom, one conference, just so we can all be on the same page. Because the worst thing that we saw, we have a very diverse community. Even within the ultra-Orthodox community, there are so many different sects and opinions. And we felt, and thank God it worked to a large degree, although it's difficult, that if we can get everybody together, communicating, talking, and saying, this is what we're dealing with. This is the particular problem facing this section of the community. On how are we going to deal with it? If we have one shul, one yeshiva, one person saying something and everybody said something else, then it's going to be extremely difficult to develop a response. And that certainly is true still today, but just to stay focused on your question, that was likely the biggest challenge as the initial days and weeks began. And I think, not me, I think we think that certainly as a community, it's, I would say, a bold statement that lives were probably even saved because of the fact that people decided, you know what, this is bigger than any one person, bigger than any one organization. This has to be something where we together figure out a response, because at the end of the day, if it saves even one life, it will have been worth it. And certainly that continues to be a challenge today with the second wave. Is it really a second wave? Is it strong? Is it worse? Is it better? The same? We'll get to that. I know it's the same thing in Israel. But certainly the worst days that we had were made a little bit easier, perhaps, I think, because of communication and because of collaboration. And I think that's something that we saw tremendous, both from an organizational perspective and from the private individuals in the community who all said, we have to help each other, not just in a metaphor. We have to really do it.
Rabbi, just to double click on the reaction, because you talked about the fact that people needed to understand what is going on here, what this is new. Can you identify one artifact or one component that you say this clearly was unique to the ultra-Orthodox community? Because in a broader sense, you can say the whole world was guessing, what am I tackling here? So is there anything unique that you can pinpoint here?
I think 100%. I think at the end of the day, every community has gatherings. Every community has meetings and work. But I think what we saw, and speaking to many of my colleagues in the healthcare world who are not in the Jewish community, not in the Orthodox community, it was like, okay, there's a virus, we have to quarantine, stay home, we stay home. And in the ultra-Orthodox community, until people realized how difficult this was, what does that mean I'm not going to shul? What does it mean I'm not going to 3 times a day? Shabbos, stay home? It was like unheard of. These are knowledgeable people who are responsible, but it's part of their DNA. And a wedding, a Sheva brachas, whatever it may have been, I think in our communities, we inherently, we get together, we have Shabbos meals packed with people. We go into shul Shabbos morning, it's the highlight for many people. And to answer your question, yes, that first phone call, that it was after Purim, it was Friday, we had about 100 rabbis on the phone from across Long Island, New York City, and we presented to them with a few doctors what we were dealing with. Yoav, there was rabbis on that phone. I get goosebumps now. They were crying. Talk about genuine. You had rabbis who were literally, I would say their names, they were crying tears. It was 5 o'clock Friday, and they were making a decision. No shuls, no synagogue, no praying, stay at home. And they were crying. So if you ask me, that's unique. In not just the ultra-Orthodox, all Orthodox, but certainly in the Jewish community, where you had rabbis crying, saying they didn't even understand what it meant to stay home. And at first, people did not want to hear it, but then they realized, okay, we don't have a choice. We have to say it live. But I'll never forget that initial day, that initial phone call. It was like traumatizing for these people.
Thank you, Rabbi Ben Bender. Yuda, basically, a rabbi is saying that when a community or when the ultra-Orthodox in the States see COVID coming, when you're so strongly based on community in the deepest sense and rituals on the deepest sense, that is almost a different magnitude of a crisis. What do you think what did you see in the response in Israel? And do you think there's anything unique in the response of ultra-Orthodox in Israel to COVID and in your guys' response to the crisis versus what you hear from your counterpart in the States?
I would say that in the first corona wave in early March was this complete disorder in Israel and also in the United States. There was work assumption that the whole ultra-Orthodox, the Haredi community or the Haredi Jews in the same boat and should have been approached in the same way. It took time to understand that the uniqueness of each subsectors, even to me, even to the Haredi municipality, the Haredi authority in Bnei Brak, it was very hard to understand the uniqueness for the subsectors. Every single group has prioritized the fact that we wear some clothes or some black and white doesn't mean that doesn't make us the same. Some groups focus on learn Torah with Chavruta, and this is all his world for this group. Another focus about diving in mikveh every morning for the men's. Another group, something else. And stopping going to synagogue is not simple decision, not for the person and not for the rabbis. It is adaptive issues that is very hard to make.
Yuda, on that basis, so let's take it a step forward. So then you needed to react to the crisis. Now, Rabbi Ben Bender said we were based on communication and collaboration. What do you think are the key decisions, one or two key decisions that you made in the Bnei Brak municipality that helped you tackle the first wave? Trust
is the main thing. Today is not secret. The trust is basis of all is the basis for all actions. It is basis for relationships, for how to be a good father and a good mother, and state relations and residents, and even main issues for running business. But trust is not something established with slogans. Trust is a meaningful tool, but we need to do it with consistency and transferring doing. And the Hamal in Bnei Brak deal with this every day to approach to some subsector with
this with communication with
You can say in Hebrew, we'll translate.
Okay, with תקשורת מתאימה.
Okay, proper communication.
Yes, with proper communication and to understand what is the adaptive challenge for this community.
Can you give us an example of a adopted communication where you used in Bnei Brak or should be used in Bnei Brak, which is different from the rest of Israel?
For example, diving in mikveh every morning, and the else משרד הבריאות, wow.
Ministry of Healthcare.
Ministry of, yes, and we decided that we can open the mikveh for 3 or 5 men, not in the same time. These things is, I think, that in Israel doesn't have any problem with mikveh for men. It's only in the Haredi community.
Okay, thank you, Yuda. And we'll, in a moment, you talked a lot about trust. Now, Rabbi Ben Bender in Israel, I'll get to Yuda in a moment, in the second wave or whatever you call it. And in Israel, we're now #1 in the world in the rate of new positive tests. The issue of trust is huge. And among the ultra-Orthodox community, there's almost an animosity towards now the establishment, and from the establishment to the ultra-Orthodox community, where we're almost, some would say, on a verge of civic rebellion. Is the relationship between the ultra-Orthodox community, as you experience it right now, and the establishment in New York State, New York City? Does it matter? Or it's a totally different construction in the issue of trust?
So it's a great question. It's a tough question as well. I'll try to answer it the best that I can. I think that, unfortunately, we're somewhere in between, where there are so many conflicting opinions, and because of the different opinions, there unfortunately have been accusations that this is being politically driven, and everybody has their own motivations for making certain proclamations. If somebody comes out and says, for example, right, just to give you an example, we just started the school year. So some schools, very, very strict. Nobody can come back unless they are tested, and very strict guidelines. And like you had by your desk, the plexiglass by each desk, and thermometers and checks the whole day. And some people said that's a great idea. We have to keep the students safe. Whereas others said this is ridiculous, it's over, and this is just being driven by the government because maybe they are overcompensating, because in the beginning they didn't respond quickly, so now we have to suffer. And to be honest, I get messages every day, completely conflicting messages. People saying, Rabbi, you must put out an email, shut everything down now. It's coming back, even Rosh Hashanah, don't go to shul, you have to stop. Other people are telling me, you have such a big audience, you have a big email list, communication. Stop. We did this, it's over, and let it go. And I think that part of it is coming from, like you said, a lack of trust. That even though, a government official is telling you what to do, is saying this is what should be done, because of the breakdown, because early on in New York State, New York City, there was a lot of deaths, for example, the nursing homes and different protocols and hospitals, and maybe, stay home, go to the hospital, what's better, what's worse. And I think people they're traumatized a little bit, and they're a little bit skeptical. I don't know if it's like complete lack of trust. That's how I would use the word, I'm going to say in Hebrew, skeptical, where they're a little bit like, they're not sure. And I think that's part of the challenge right now, and we'll get to it maybe at this time, but at the second wave, you see two very different responses. Some people are being super strict now, and some people are saying, I'm done.
And on that matter, just a follow-up question. In Israel, I would say that there's a layer in between or above. That is the rabbinic establishment. Like a few days ago, the great Rabbi Kanievsky said, don't go do tests. And the Corona Tsar of Israel, Roni Gamzo, said, don't listen to Rabbi Kanievsky. Now, all those who know the Haredi community, you don't say, don't listen to Rabbi Kanievsky. On the other hand, the Corona Tsar, so it's almost there. And after that, Rabbi Hirsch says, go to quarantine. So it has almost become an issue of a mixture of halacha, religion, state. From what I hear from you, that's not the issue in New York in the ultra-Orthodox community.
So are you sure we don't live in the same country? I'm not so sure. Because at the end of the day, it's not the primary issue, but I will tell you, it has been a very hard balance between, it has been actually, between, yes, we're listening to our doctors and the government, but because so many of these issues are specific to the Orthodox community and to halakha and shul and learning and davening and chaftanos, so there is a little bit of a clash between my doctor says this, my rabbi says this, and the doctor says it's medical, you listen to me, and the rabbi says it's halakha, you listen to me. So one thing we've worked on doing, which is why maybe it's not as bad, is that when we have these phone calls and these conversations, we've been trying to merge the two, where we have on the same phone calls and the same meetings, a rabbinic authority and a medical authority, or even medical authorities that are rabbis. That exists as well. And then they can wear two hats to try to come to a fine balance. So I wouldn't say it's as bad, but it's definitely been an issue because of what Yehuda said, that so many of the issues in our communities are centered around, like you said, the things that we do every single day, from mikvah to shul to, there was a question yesterday about a wedding, the amount of people, Sheva brachos, new people, old people, halacha questions. But then they were torn because the government said this amount of people can come. So it's a fine balance.
On that note, Yehuda, you wanted to react?
I will share with you a personal story. About a week ago, I made an appointment with a friend in Caesarea. There is a nice coffee there. I arrived early, about half an hour before my friend. I stood in the doorway of the coffee, waiting for the hostess. Unfortunately, after 15 minutes, standing and staring, getting more and more annoyed. I felt as I was the one who brought the corona to Caesarea. The experience that I unfortunately, it's not only me. It is the feeling of large part in the Haredi community. And I talked before about trust. Trust is not only between the authority and the Haredi community, between the government and between the municipality. It's between the Haredi community and the whole population in Israel. The trust is something that we are in Bnei Brak remember, and we told to us and to and to all everyone that want to hear. The trust is the key. Also, you talk about Reb Chaim Kanievsky and Roni Gamzo. It's also about trust. In the fact today, there's things between Roni Gamzo and between Reb Chaim Kanievsky. It's all good. Why? Because they're not before that they doesn't have communication. And today, with the communication and with trust, we can working together. I learned that the DNA of great organization in its road in innovation and operating flexibility. The crisis is not only a crisis, it's also opportunity, and can and should prepare strategically of changing reality. In Bnei Brak Enterprise Development Company and in Bnei Brak Municipality, we are very attentive to what's happening in the world. And we understand exactly well the value of sense of security for employees and their families. It's critical to both to the workplace and to the mental power of employee. In addition, we have prepared for the use technology for remote work, accelerated an operation to both the automatic machines that provide service to the resident, and moved to work in shift while maintaining the organizational service survival. What I mean to do to tell you that in Bnei Brak, the crisis is also opportunity to employ health and to safety the city and the employees in the Bnei Brak municipality.
So Yuda, thank you. You led me already into the last question. I just want a follow-up, and then we'll close with Rabbi Ben Bender. You talked about all kinds of opportunities like remote working, economic development, and so on that COVID has brought. Do you see opportunities, or do you expect something in the behavior or in the norms of the population to adjust or to change according to their reality? Do you have, or the states towards the population or others towards the population?
I think that the local authority need to give more power to deal with the population. And the local authority is the channel that we need to talk with the population, not the government. We need to prioritize the services. The government need to prioritize the services. I am running the enterprise company in Bnei Brak. I often ask why Bnei Brak or in other cities need an enterprise company. There is a municipality. And like a good Jew, I answer with the question, why we need a local authority? There is a government. But the answer is that the government need to privatize the services. Because if you want to better to give a better services for the resident, you need to privatize the services. And if the government want to talk with the Haredi community, they need to do it through the local authority.
Thank you, Yuda. Rabbi Ben Bender, on that note, what when you look forward, what do you expect from the ultra-Orthodox community? Do you expect any changes in practices in tackling COVID and going forward? Maybe the authorities, what do you see going forward, and what do you expect is going to happen?
So I think it's a terrific question, because so often when we deal with a crisis, and that's anybody in the world, we always feel like this crisis at this time is going to be lasting change, you know? And this one's going to affect us. And then the way the world works, it doesn't always pan out. You know, a long time ago, my father's a Rosh Hashiva, we left a funeral, and somebody turns to us about 25 years ago, and I was a little kid, and he said, "This was a very hard funeral. This was a big loss, and this one's going to stay with us for a while." And the other rabbi turns back, he says, "Yeah, you're right, for 20 minutes, you know?" he was making a point. However, I do think that, just to answer both parts of your question, I think there's going to be changes. I think that there's definitely going to be a little bit more of an awareness to our actions. I think when it comes both to when we go to shul or weddings, sometimes large and out of control and just mass gatherings, I do feel, maybe I hope in a positive way, I think that's going to change a little bit, and where people have realized, you know, what's most important. Not the biggest, craziest, most people there, but, you know, keeping people safe and our families. I'm seeing that from people who I never would have thought that this would be their attitude. And I think because it's gone on for so long, and because it's still going on in many ways, I think that we're going to see maybe for real this time some lasting change, and I hope in a better way. And I think that there'll also be more of a, I hope, a respect for the medical authorities, a respect for, you know, Das Torah, for the rabbis, because at the end of the day, no matter if you have $5, 6 shekel, or $4 billion, this crisis affected you. And the phone calls I received were from the wealthy people, the people with no money, kippah, no kippah, made no difference, because everybody was stuck. Everybody was, oh my God, what do I do? And I think that this has humbled people to realize that we're all in this together, and we need leadership from our rabbis, from our doctors, and like Yehuda said, we need to have some trust, because unfortunately we saw some very difficult stories early on where people were, unfortunately, some people, you know, lost their lives, many people, or worse, or fighting and things like that. And I think if we realize, going back to my first response, that if we communicate better and we trust a little more, and we a little more active, I think, you know, Hurricane Sandy was a big deal, affected many people. So we had similar responses, but this was across the board. Right now, we're in you know, almost Rosh Hashanah, and dozens of people, my own family, I have relatives who are in quarantine all over again now. So I think this is a very humbling crisis, and I hope that we'll take from it, whether you're in Israel, America, South Africa, wherever, the positive changes. It'll make us happier, stronger, and I hope there's never again a crisis like this, but if there is, maybe we'll be a little bit more prepared, maybe.
So thank you, guys. Maybe on a closing note, we're now in Chodesh Slichot and towards Rosh Hashanah. I think, to give my perspective, I think we in Maoz for a few years are now are trying to advocate the fact that the Israeli society is changing. And whether you like it or not, we always tell people we don't care. That is reality. There are two populations who are becoming more and more dominant demographically. The combination of Arabs and ultra-Orthodox, and the only thing that there is similar is the fact that they're not fully integrated and connected to the state of Israel, to the establishment of the state of Israel. And we can close our eyes, both sides, the ultra-Orthodox community and the rest of Israeli society and the establishment. And that's what we've been doing in the past years in some parts trying to work together and create trust. And COVID, for sure, is a wake-up call, because we see now that either we will live together or we will not live. And I think we are right now in Israel. I can tell you and project to you, we are in the midst of the crisis. It's like we're about to get into lockdown. The distrust and mistrust is all over. But I think, and this is my hope towards this Rosh Hashanah, that in Yom Kippur, that this will be a time of reflection in Israel, saying, okay, we're here. Nobody's going anywhere. Now we need to figure out how to live together. We did not establish, I think, a Jewish state in order to destroy one another, but rather to live and prosper together, each one upon and according the way he thinks his community should live, but also We should have a vision of what is the common good here. So with that hope, I'll thank you again, gentlemen. Thank Latet that gave us all this opportunity to have this interesting discussion. And goodbye from Lod, Israel.
Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you all for sharing your knowledge and expertise. Our conference is coming to an end, but before we part, it is my absolute honor to invite our last two speakers. Rachel Monroe is president and CEO of the Harry and Jeanette Weinberg Foundation, one of the largest and oldest Jewish philanthropic foundations. During the COVID-19 crisis, they quickly provided generous and widespread emergency funding to nonprofits throughout Israel and the US. Rachel has been a leader in Jewish philanthropy and recently organized a national dialogue on Jewish poverty in the United States. Please welcome Rachel Monroe.
Boker Tov. Michal, thank you very much for the kind introduction. As you know, the Weinberg Foundation has been providing about $12 million a year in grant funding to Amutot in Israel. All Weinberg Foundation funding is focused on helping families and individuals experiencing poverty. We do not raise any money, we do not do any research or advocacy or policy work, and we do not fund universities. All we do is invest our assets, roughly $3 billion, and distribute about $125 million in grants each year. In Israel, the foundation has for many years given $12 million a year in grants, focused in three priority areas: low-income older adults, helping individuals find and keep jobs with livable wages, and women and their children at risk. We also introduced for the first time in 30 years a Weinberg Foundation trustee who is Israeli and living in Israel, Mr. Nimrod Gur, who has been an important and a terrific addition to the Weinberg Foundation. So, what has Corona done for Weinberg in Israel? As a result of Corona, the first thing the foundation did was increase its funding from $12 to $13 million this year. And to date, about $1.5 million of those dollars is focused on Corona. We have relied on trusted partners, including the Jewish Funders Network Israel, Bituach Leumi, the JDC or the Joint, and strong umbrella organizations such as Co-Impact and the Association of Rape Crisis Centers in Israel. Weinberg has provided just over $1 million in partnership with the foundations of Bituach Leumi, the National Insurance Institute of Israel, all given in smaller grant awards to nonprofits working in three areas that Weinberg works in that I just mentioned, as well as the areas of healthcare and support for asylum seekers. We also provided $250,000 to WIZO to support 14 domestic violence shelters in Israel as a result of all of the increased costs related to Corona, and $200,000 through the Association of Rape Crisis Centers in Israel for their increased costs. We also focused on food insecurity and accessibility, particularly for older adults. And with partners like Latet, which already has established systems of efficiency at scale, it became easier to figure out how to get many isolated older adults basic and emergency needs while making them feel connected and not alone. We have increased our funding of operating support to maximize flexibility for nonprofits in this moment. We have accelerated grant payments of more than $500,000 to help Amutot with cash now. And we have done our best to conduct virtual site visits and meetings to stay in touch with our grantees from afar. During this time, the foundation has worked to address emergency needs where philanthropy can make a difference, but not replace government response in the area of human services. Acknowledging the challenge of working with the government of Israel in a second year without an official budget complicates this further. And in many cases, Amutot face incredible fiscal hardship while trying to meet increased needs. We see philanthropy as both an art and a science and work from both our heads and our hearts. In moments of crisis, it is important to balance all of those agendas and to continue to focus on the foundation's priorities, despite so many needs. I would also say shared access to information with colleagues at other foundations in Israel, being in conversation with government ministries and leaders across sectors in Israel has been critical in enabling the foundation to establish the correct partners to provide support for Corona that we hope is both impactful and meaningful. In a moment of crisis, what we want to say is that while the Weinberg Foundation is based in the United States, its leadership and trustees and staff are passionately committed to serving those in need in Israel. We stand with all of you. We believe with collaborative partners like Latet and its vast network of tireless volunteers, Israel will come through this time of Corona even stronger than before. Israel's character is built on adaptability and a refusal to accept being handed fate, always seeking another way, a different result, just as Israel's brilliant scientists and companies are doing now in response to Corona. We know that Gam Zeh Ya'avor, this too shall pass. Finally, we hope that this new year will bring one of hope, resolve, and better times ahead, and wish you all a Shana Tova U'Metuka. We truly mean it when we say we hope we can see you in person next year in Jerusalem. I want to thank you for the good work that you do, and I want to wish you good luck in the year ahead. Toda rabah ve'ba'hatzlacha. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, for all the work you do. Our final speaker is no other than Israel's coronavirus commissioner and has the difficult task of leading Israel's national response to COVID-19. Professor Roni Gamzu, the CEO of Tel Aviv's Ichilov Hospital, was appointed head of the National Coronavirus Task Force and will share with us his insight on the future of the pandemic. Please welcome Professor Roni Gamzu.
Thank you so much, Michal, for this presentation. Really, the Corona era and the time that we are now in Israel and all around the world is a challenging event, the challenging crisis, and we need to lead the way and to understand what we are doing all around the world. So in Israel, on the second wave, we are trying to avoid lockdown, and we've succeeded to do so for 3 to 4 months. We are handling since May the Corona event without lockdowns. Israelis, they've turned back to their lives, to their jobs, to the education system, schools. If you are walking around Israeli street, you will find everybody are doing the same ordinary life. Of course, we are trying to minimize gathering. We are trying to adhere to the regulation, wearing masks. And of course, we have accommodate many regulations regarding gathering within places or outdoors. This is what we have to try to do all around the world, because we have to learn how to more or less dance with Corona. It will take us months before we will have vaccine. And until that, people have to adjust to accommodate to a different lifestyle, to a different way to do our daily life, working, education system, fun, all what we are used to do, friends, anything in a different way, in a way that we will reduce the rate of infection. And this is what we have done all through the months here in Israel. We had a climb in the cases, and it was very steep all around Israel. It was in many cities, mainly in the Arab community. But, if you take the general population as well as the Orthodox and all the general population in Israel, now we have a steep climb in the number of infected Corona cases. Hospitals and the healthcare system in Israel are doing fine. Still, they are in distress. It is not so easy, but this is their task. They know what they should do, and this is what we are trying to do. Parallel to that, we are building an infrastructure with the army, with the IDF, in order to allow ourselves to have a real, I would say, factory of cutting chain of infection and running the cities with the IDF within cities, trying to locate and to sample and to test. Israel has a very high rate of testing all around the cities and all around Israel. Still, we are diagnosing many people with corona. Now we have 4,000 a day. This is also because we are testing so much, and this is the way to go. And we really believe that this is the way to fight corona. But we cannot avoid that the number has climbed to 4,000, and really it makes some kind of anxiety. However, we have also to acknowledge that we are entering the holidays area. And the holidays era in Israel are not only religious kind of holidays, but also cultural. People are gathering in family dinners and many events going all around Israel, touristic attractions, hotels and parties, also all kind of religious events that can cause gathering and cause the infection rate to go even higher. So this is the time to restrain, and this is the time to contain, and this is the time to do some kind of a lockdown. This is what we have decided yesterday in the cabinet, in the government of Israel. This is the time to do so for 3 to 4 weeks. I believe any society with such a high burden, I would say, of holidays, with the same phenomena, characteristic that we have in the holidays in Israel, should do. We should do that because this is the way to reduce exponential climb of cases. Such a climb can, make or break the healthcare system, not only in the hospitals, but also in the community care. So this is what we are doing. We will start that in the middle of the next week, around Wednesday, for 3 to 4 weeks. The people of Israel understand that this is the way to go, and they really understand the challenge. We know challenges. Israelis are used to have missile around their head. We will adhere to the regulation, and we will fight and win this corona war. This is what all around the world people are doing, governments. Second wave is a different kind of handling. First wave, we done lockdown from the first place. Second wave, we do much more management. Management and managing the corona, trying to manipulate it and trying to adhere to our lives. And we will succeed. This is what we are doing. This is all around the world. You can see the states is also adhering to life in the different states, different kind of approaches, but more or less people are trying to live and not to close themselves in the curfews or lockdowns. But when such countries are reaching a point like we have reached, a point where you have on one hand gathering, on the second hand many cases of positive infected corona cases, then you have to adhere to what should be done. So first of all, Irgun Latet, thank you so much for what you are doing in Israel, all around the world, and for your spirit, for your devotion. And this is from the bottom of my heart. I would say also many people in Israel would say so. Let's have Rosh Hashanah Sameach, Happy New Year, and of course all the holidays that are coming, Yom Kippurim and Sukkot, and we share the same feelings all around the world. And I hope that we will have the chance to meet physically. And you see me, I'm recording this from a quarantine because I was near a corona patient. So in a quarantine for a few days. I'm corona negative, but still have to close my quarantine days. I will be out before Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah Sameach. Shalom lekulam, v'toda rabba.
Thank you, Professor Gamzu. We greatly appreciate your participation today. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us. Thank you to our distinguished speakers who continue to make our society a more inclusive and supportive place for all. We hope the inspiring conversations today are the beginning of a long-lasting dialogue our joint effort will no doubt help better serve our societies as we continue to battle COVID-19. We wish you all health, bריאות לכולם, shalom, toda, and thank you.